What does an entire city do in the exact moment it becomes convinced the sun is dying in the sky above it? Somewhere in the ancient world, at midday, the light starts failing. Not clouds, not dusk, the sun itself, visibly being consumed. Dogs start howling before people fully register what is happening. Birds go silent and drop into trees as though night has arrived in the space of 90 seconds. The temperature falls fast enough to feel on bare skin. Then the sky itself changes color in a way that has no earthly equivalent. A bruised, deepening twilight arriving from every direction at once, while a ring of fire burns silently around a perfect black disk where the sun used to be. Now, imagine you have no concept of orbital mechanics, no idea that the moon is a physical object passing directly between you and a star. All you know is that the single most reliable, most permanent thing in your entire world has started to disappear. Across dozens of civilizations with no contact with one another, separated by oceans and centuries, the recorded reaction is startlingly consistent. Screaming, weeping, improvised, desperate ritual, banging metal, shouting at the sky, anything to drive away whatever was devouring the sun. In ancient China, court records describe the practice of beating drums and firing arrows into the sky during eclipses, an attempt to frighten off the celestial dog or dragon believed to be swallowing the sun whole. In ancient India, some traditions describe the demon Rahu, a severed head with no body, chasing down and briefly devouring the sun and moon in an endless act of cosmic revenge, only for the light to fall back out of his throatless neck moments later. The Vikings feared sky wolves, Skoll and Hati, locked in an eternal chase to devour the sun and moon, a hunt that was believed to finally succeed at Ragnarok, the end of the world itself. Different continents, different gods, different languages entirely for the same event. And yet the underlying story stays almost identical everywhere it appears. Something is eating the sun, and only frantic human effort can force it to let go. There's a reason that particular fear runs so deep and so universal. For nearly the entire span of human existence, the sun was, functionally, the most reliable object anyone had ever known. It never failed to rise, until on rare and terrifying occasions, it did. A predictable universe is a survivable universe. Crops grow on schedule. Seasons turn on schedule. The sun rises on schedule. An eclipse breaks that schedule without warning, in broad daylight, in front of everyone, and offers no explanation whatsoever for why. Modern astronomy can now predict a solar eclipse's exact time and path centuries in advance, down to the second. That certainty is recent. For most of human history, an eclipse was simply an ambush staged by the sky itself, against everyone standing beneath it. This documentary is not really about eclipses, not specifically. It is about everything that fear produced afterward. The obsessive counting. The priesthoods built to interpret the sky before it could ambush anyone again. The astronomers, centuries later, who finally turned that ambush into a scheduled, almost boring event. Every civilization we visit across the next several hours built its own answer to that terror. Some built calendars. Some built temples aligned with obsessive, almost pathological precision. Some built entire political systems around who was allowed to interpret the warning signs. And it starts, as most things eventually do, with a single question that a much older, much colder darkness had already been asking for tens of thousands of years before any of these civilizations existed. Could the sky, this unpredictable, terrifying thing, actually be counted? It is worth noting how quickly modern eclipse chasers, people who travel across continents specifically to stand inside the path of totality, describe feeling something eerily similar to those ancient panicked crowds, despite knowing, with complete scientific certainty, exactly what is about to happen and precisely why. Multiple surveys of modern eclipse observers report a startling, involuntary emotional response. Gasps, tears, a kind of primal awe that persists even in minds fully equipped with orbital mechanics and advanced warning. Knowledge, it turns out, does not fully disarm the fear. It simply gives the fear somewhere safe to land. That persistence matters for everything that follows. This documentary is not simply describing a primitive fear that science eventually cured. It is describing a fear that never actually left, one that modern humans have simply gotten better at managing, scheduling, and, when useful, monetizing into tourism. Modern eclipse chasers describe a specific, involuntary reaction even when they know, with complete scientific certainty, exactly what is about to happen and precisely why. Gasps, tears, a kind of primal awe that persists despite total foreknowledge. Proof that understanding a phenomenon and feeling safe from it are not actually the same thing. That persistence matters for everything that follows in this documentary. We are not simply describing a primitive fear that science eventually cured. We are describing a fear that never fully left, one that modern humans have simply gotten better at scheduling, managing, and occasionally turning into tourism. In ancient Korea, court records describe similar drumming and shouting rituals during eclipses, remarkably close in form to practices recorded independently in China, despite each tradition developing its own separate mythology to explain exactly what was happening in the sky above them. Among some Inuit communities, oral tradition describes the sun and moon as siblings locked in a troubled, sometimes violent relationship, with an eclipse marking a moment of crisis between them, a myth entirely disconnected from Asian or Mesoamerican traditions, yet built from the same basic instinct to explain the inexplicable through relationship and conflict. It is genuinely worth marveling at how consistently this eclipse panic appears even among cultures with sophisticated agricultural calendars and organized religion, civilizations that had already solved considerably harder problems than tracking the sun's ordinary daily path, and yet still reacted to its temporary disappearance with something close to pure animal terror. There is a specific detail worth naming about how long this fear persisted even after prediction became possible. Chinese court records from centuries after eclipse prediction had become mathematically reliable, still describe ordinary citizens engaging in protective rituals during eclipses, suggesting official scientific confidence and popular emotional response moved at very different speeds. Consider the specific physiological signature of an eclipse a modern scientist can now measure precisely. Barometric pressure shifts slightly. Local temperature can drop as much as 15 degrees within minutes. Wind patterns sometimes change direction entirely, a genuine, measurable disturbance in the local environment, not merely a visual spectacle, which likely deepened the ancient sense that something was fundamentally, physically wrong with the world. It is worth naming that lunar eclipses, though less visually dramatic than their solar counterparts, generated their own distinct body of fear and interpretation across ancient cultures. The moon's characteristic reddish tint during totality frequently read as a sign of blood, illness, or impending disaster in traditions spanning from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. It is worth naming that some ancient cultures developed a genuinely different emotional relationship to eclipses over time, with certain Chinese court traditions eventually treating a successfully predicted eclipse as an opportunity to publicly display state competence rather than panic, transforming the same celestial event into a demonstration of imperial control over knowledge rather than a moment of vulnerability. Consider, finally, that even now, with total scientific understanding of the mechanism, a total solar eclipse remains one of the very few natural phenomena capable of reliably reducing large crowds of scientifically literate adults to spontaneous cheering, applause, and tears, evidence that some reactions may simply be wired too deep to fully outgrow, regardless of how thoroughly the mystery has been solved. It is worth remembering, too, that not every ancient culture responded to eclipses with pure terror. Some Native American traditions treated eclipses with cautious ritual respect rather than outright panic. Communities pausing ordinary activity and observing quiet reflection, evidence that fear was the dominant, but never the universal human response to this particular sky event. It is worth naming, too, that solar eclipses recur at any given point on Earth's surface with genuine rarity, often centuries apart for the exact same location, meaning many ancient communities may have experienced only 1 or 2 total solar eclipses across many generations, each occurrence essentially unprecedented within living memory, arriving with no accumulated cultural experience to draw on. It is worth noting, finally, that the very concept of a predictable eclipse cycle, the Saros this documentary discusses more fully in a later chapter, was itself a product of exactly the kind of patient, generational fear-driven observation this opening chapter describes, meaning terror and mathematics were never actually opposites in this story. Terror was, in a very real sense, the engine that eventually produced the mathematics. It is worth remembering, finally, that this opening chapter's title, "The Sun is Being Eaten," was never simply a metaphor to the people who first used language like it. They meant it literally, describing what they genuinely believed was happening in real time above their heads. A detail worth holding onto whenever this documentary's later, more analytical chapters risk making that original terror feel abstract or distant. It is worth remembering, one final time before this chapter closes, that every civilization this documentary covers across the next several hours experienced this exact same disorienting darkness at some point in its own history, meaning the eclipse functions less as a single opening image and more as a genuine thread, quietly connecting every single culture this story is about to introduce you to. Why would a Paleolithic hunter, alone in the dark with nothing but a knife and a piece of bone, carve a series of small, deliberate notches that happen to match, with unsettling precision, the phases of the moon? In 1960, a Belgian geologist working near Lake Edward in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo uncovered a small carved bone tool, dated to roughly 20,000 years old. It became known as the Ishango bone. Its surface carries 3 columns of notches arranged in distinct, deliberate groupings. Some researchers argue those groupings track lunar phases across roughly 6 months. Others believe it is simply an early counting or tallying device, unrelated to the sky at all. That disagreement has never fully resolved, and it likely never will with the evidence currently available. But even under the more cautious interpretation, the object itself is remarkable. Someone deep in the last ice age needed to count something with enough precision to carve it permanently into bone. Older still is the Lubombo bone, discovered in the Lubombo Mountains on the border of modern Eswatini in South Africa, dated to approximately 43,000 years ago. It bears 29 distinct notches cut along its edge. 29 notches sits remarkably close to the number of days in a lunar cycle. If the interpretation holds, this may be the oldest mathematical artifact ever produced by a human being, tens of thousands of years before Sumer, before Egypt, before agriculture itself existed anywhere on Earth. Archaeologists urge real caution here, and it is worth taking that caution seriously rather than skipping past it for a better story. A handful of scratches on bone does not, by itself, prove astronomical intent. It could easily be a hunting tally, a simple record of days, or something we cannot even guess at from this distance. What is harder to dismiss is the underlying pattern that keeps showing up across Paleolithic sites on multiple continents. Deliberate, repeated counting, often in groups suspiciously close to 29 or 30, the rough length of a lunar month, appearing again and again in unrelated locations. There is also a genuinely contested body of research into European Ice Age cave art, particularly at sites like Lascaux in France, where certain painted animals are accompanied by dot patterns that some archaeologists have proposed represent early star clusters, most notably the Pleiades. that theory remains genuinely debated within the field. Some researchers find the alignment compelling. Others argue we are simply projecting our own fascination with the stars backward onto artists who were, most likely, just painting the animals they depended on for survival. Both positions deserve to be heard honestly. Regardless of which specific interpretation eventually wins out, something important was already happening in these communities well before recorded history begins. The sky, once purely a source of unpredictable dread, was starting to be treated as something that could, at least partially, be measured. And that measurement was never purely academic curiosity. Knowing the moon's phase meant knowing the tide. Knowing the tide meant knowing when certain fish ran, when certain shellfish beds were exposed, when it was safest to move a hunting party across open, exposed terrain under moonlight. In this earliest chapter of the relationship between humans and the sky, there is no priesthood yet, no temple, no political monopoly on the knowledge, just individuals, alone in the dark, deciding that a terrifying, unpredictable universe could be made slightly smaller with a knife and enough patience. That would not last, because the moment agriculture arrived, the moment cities rose along fertile river valleys and required organized labor, organized religion, and organized power, someone was going to notice that whoever could read the sky first held something far more valuable than survival information. They held authority. It is worth pausing on just how long this Paleolithic period of relatively democratic sky knowledge actually lasted, compared to everything that follows it in this documentary. Tens of thousands of years of individual hunters and gatherers, each free to look up and count for themselves, against a mere few thousand years of organized, centralized priestly control that came afterward. Framed that way, the temple monopolies of Babylon and Egypt look less like humanity's natural, inevitable relationship with the sky, and considerably more like a relatively recent, specific historical development, one that happened to coincide precisely with the rise of concentrated political power and organized inequality. That is a genuinely useful thing to hold in mind as this documentary moves forward through priesthoods, emperors, and inquisitions. The fear of the sky is ancient and universal. The idea that only a select few are qualified to interpret it is, by comparison, a considerably younger and more contingent invention. It helps to picture the actual physical conditions surrounding this early counting, because comfort played no part in it. No electric light, no reliable heat beyond a fire requiring constant tending. A hunter studying the moon did so exhausted, often hungry, in a body with no guarantee of surviving until the next cycle came around to check the count against. Modern experimental archaeologists, attempting to replicate ancient observational methods using only period-appropriate tools and materials, have confirmed that tracking lunar phases with simple notched implements is entirely achievable, but demands sustained attention across weeks that would have directly competed with the far more urgent daily business of simply staying alive. There's also something worth naming about who likely held this knowledge within a small band. Anthropological study of surviving hunter-gatherer societies suggests seasonal and celestial expertise was often concentrated among older members, elders whose decades of accumulated observation effectively made them a group's living calendar, its only reliable memory of the sky's patterns. There's a further detail worth naming about how these early counting systems may have functioned socially within a small band. A shared, agreed-upon count of days would have required some form of communication and consensus among group members, meaning these bone tools may represent not just individual observation, but among the earliest evidence of coordinated, shared human knowledge-keeping. It is genuinely worth marveling at how this instinct toward counting appears to predate not just cities and writing, but very likely spoken language as we would recognize it today, meaning some of the very first complex thoughts our species ever had may have concerned nothing more or less than the changing shape of the moon. Consider, too, how differently this early relationship with the sky compares to nearly everything that follows later in this documentary. No priest stood between a Paleolithic observer and the moon. No temple charged admission to the knowledge. It was, in its own quiet way, the most democratic relationship with the sky humanity would have for tens of thousands of years afterward. There is a further detail worth naming about the specific tools used to create these ancient markings. Microscopic analysis of the Ashango bone's notches has revealed variation in cutting technique and pressure, suggesting the marks were made across multiple separate sessions rather than all at once. Physical evidence supporting the theory that this was an ongoing, actively maintained record rather than a single completed artifact. It is worth naming that lunar observation likely served a second, equally practical purpose beyond seasonal timing: tidal prediction for communities living near coastlines, where knowing the moon's phase meant knowing when shellfish beds would be exposed or when fishing conditions would be most favorable. Another direct, tangible survival benefit layered on top of pure calendar tracking. Consider, finally, that this entire opening era of human sky watching unfolded without a single written word anywhere on Earth, meaning everything we know about it comes exclusively from physical artifacts and careful archaeological inference. A genuinely humbling limitation worth remembering whenever this documentary speaks about these early observers with more confidence than the fragmentary evidence can strictly support. It is worth remembering, too, that similar notched bone artifacts, potentially serving comparable observational functions, have been identified at scattered sites across Europe and Asia as well, suggesting this basic technique of marking time through deliberate physical notation may have developed independently, multiple times, wherever humans face the same basic challenge of tracking recurring celestial cycles. It is worth naming, too, that similar counting systems using notched wood rather than bone likely existed as well, though it decomposes far more readily than bone or stone, meaning the small number of surviving bone artifacts this chapter describes almost certainly represent only a tiny surviving fraction of a considerably more widespread ancient practice. It is worth noting, finally, that this documentary's entire subsequent journey through priesthoods, empires, and mathematics ultimately traces back to this same basic Paleolithic impulse, simply scaled up, formalized, and eventually weaponized by increasingly complex societies. The scale changed dramatically. The underlying human need to make an unpredictable sky feel slightly less unpredictable never actually did. It is worth remembering, finally, that these Paleolithic observers had no way of knowing their careful counting would eventually be recognized, tens of thousands of years later, as among the earliest evidence of scientific thought our species ever produced. They were simply trying to survive one more season, one more winter, one more uncertain stretch of darkness, with slightly better information than they had before. It is worth remembering one absolute final time that we will likely never know the actual name, language, or specific tribal identity of whoever carved the Lobombo bone. A genuinely humbling gap in an otherwise remarkable story, the very first mathematician we can point to in the entire archaeological record remaining, and probably always remaining completely and permanently anonymous. What did it mean, exactly, for a Babylonian king to receive an urgent letter from his royal advisors reporting that the planet Venus had simply vanished from the night sky? In Mesopotamia, that was never treated as trivial astronomical trivia. It was treated as a warning aimed directly at the throne. Across roughly 3,000 years, Mesopotamian scribes maintained one of the longest continuous observational records in human history, tracking planetary positions, lunar eclipses, and the appearance of comets with obsessive, almost fanatical consistency. That record eventually formed a compiled body of texts known collectively as the Enuma Anu Enlil, roughly 70 tablets pairing specific celestial events with specific predicted disasters. A red halo circling the moon, a particular planet's sudden absence. Each entry logged alongside its supposed consequence for the kingdom. Famine, military defeat, The death of a monarch. According to this system, the sky hung above Mesopotamia, constantly transmitting verdicts, never passive scenery, and someone had to be trained full-time to translate those verdicts correctly. That job belonged to a specialized class of scholar priests, and their surviving correspondence with the royal court reads less like devotional religious writing and more like anxious, high-stakes intelligence briefings prepared for a ruler who genuinely could not afford to be caught unprepared. One surviving letter reports, with evident concern, an unusually long disappearance of Venus from the visible sky. To modern astronomy, this is simply orbital mechanics, Venus passing too close to the sun's glare to be observed. To the Babylonian court, it may have read as the goddess Ishtar personally withdrawing her favor. Imagine carrying that particular job description. Every single observation you formally reported to the palace had the potential to reshape military strategy, royal marriages, even executions. Deliver news the king did not want to hear, and the consequences for the messenger were rarely purely academic. This system produced something genuinely valuable alongside the fear it generated. Because these priests needed to predict celestial events accurately, not simply describe them after the fact, Babylonian astronomy developed a level of mathematical sophistication that would remain unmatched by most of the ancient world for over 1,000 years. They tracked the movements of the 5 visible planets across the zodiac with increasing precision over centuries, building predictive tables that later Greek astronomers would study, borrow from, and ultimately build directly on top of. It is worth sitting, though, with the underlying power structure this knowledge created. In Babylon, understanding the sky was never treated as public information freely available to any curious citizen. It was closely held, tightly rationed, controlled by an elite class whose entire social position depended on remaining the only ones who could read it correctly. That arrangement, knowledge of the heavens converted directly into political leverage over an anxious ruler, was not unique to Mesopotamia. It was, in fact, only the first version of a pattern this documentary is going to encounter again and again in wildly different cultures, wearing wildly different names. In China, it would take the form of an entire cosmology tied directly to imperial legitimacy. In Rome, emperors would come to fear their own court astrologers so thoroughly they would periodically have them banished or killed. The details change. The underlying anxiety that the sky might be quietly plotting against the person sitting on the throne does not. But before we travel east to China or north into Rome, there's one more river valley civilization that took this relationship between the sky and political power somewhere even stranger. Somewhere the stakes reached past the merely military or economic, tied directly to what happened to a ruler's soul after death itself. It is worth naming the specific working conditions of a Babylonian court astronomer a little more concretely. Cuneiform tablets describe a rotating system of watches, teams of scribes taking shifts through the night to ensure the sky was never left unobserved, every visible planet and star tracked in relay, year after year, without a single confirmed gap in the record. That level of institutional discipline, sustained across generations, is genuinely remarkable, regardless of the fear driving it. It represents one of the earliest examples in human history of what we might now recognize as continuous, systematic scientific data collection, organized and funded specifically because a king's anxiety demanded it. It is worth naming specifically the working conditions of a Babylonian court astronomer a little more concretely. Cuneiform tablets describe rotating watches, teams of scribes taking shifts through the night to ensure the sky was never left unobserved, every visible planet tracked in relay across generations without a single confirmed gap in the record. That level of institutional discipline, sustained across generations regardless of political upheaval, represents one of the earliest known examples of continuous, systematic data collection anywhere in human history. organized and funded specifically because a king's anxiety demanded it be maintained without interruption. There's a particular kind of exhaustion worth naming directly here as well. Surviving records describing the astrologer priest's duties suggest men who rarely enjoyed a night entirely free of obligation, their careers, and at times their lives, calibrated against a sky offering no days off and no forgiveness for a missed or clouded observation. It is worth naming, too, that this Babylonian astrological system did not disappear when the empire itself eventually collapsed. It was absorbed, translated, and substantially reworked by later Greek, Roman, and eventually Arabic astrologers, forming a continuous thread of practice connecting directly to horoscope columns still printed today, an unbroken lineage stretching back roughly 3,000 years. There's a final, quieter detail worth including here. Among the surviving Babylonian astronomical diaries, alongside grand omens and royal warnings, sit entirely mundane entries: cloud cover, the price of barley, ordinary weather, the sacred and the utterly ordinary recorded side by side on the very same clay by the very same anxious, patient hand. Consider, too, the sheer psychological weight carried by the specific Babylonian term used for these celestial warnings, often translatable as evil signs, a phrase that framed the sky not as neutral phenomena awaiting interpretation, but as an active, sometimes hostile force capable of directing genuine malice toward a kingdom and its ruler. There's a further detail worth naming about how these omens interacted with practical statecraft. Surviving records suggest Babylonian kings sometimes deliberately timed military campaigns or diplomatic negotiations to coincide with favorable celestial reports, meaning astrology functioned not merely as passive interpretation, but as an active tool for building political consensus and justifying decisions already made on more practical grounds. It is worth naming that this Babylonian tradition of celestial record-keeping directly enabled one of the more remarkable achievements in the history of ancient science: the ability to retroactively date historical events with precision by cross-referencing describe celestial phenomena against modern astronomical calculation, effectively letting the sky itself serve as an incorruptible historical clock. Consider, finally, that this Babylonian relationship between sky and sovereignty proved remarkably durable across political upheaval, surviving conquest by the Assyrians, the eventual rise and fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and Persian conquest under Cyrus the Great. The underlying astrological practice persisting largely intact even as the specific political powers claiming its authority changed hands repeatedly. It is worth remembering, too, that the specific astrological texts this chapter describes were written in a highly technical, specialized cuneiform vocabulary distinct from everyday administrative writing, meaning literacy in ordinary commercial cuneiform did not automatically grant access to these restricted astronomical and astrological texts, reinforcing the priesthood's practical monopoly even among the broader literate population. It is worth naming, too, that Babylonian astronomical diaries eventually recorded market prices for staple goods alongside celestial observations for well over 4 centuries continuously, creating what modern economic historians now consider one of the longest unbroken economic data series from the ancient world, an unexpected byproduct of a system originally built entirely around fear of the sky. It is worth noting, finally, that the Babylonian astrological tradition's genuine mathematical sophistication should not obscure how thoroughly it also functioned as a tool of social control, the two facts existing simultaneously and without contradiction: genuine science and genuine oppression built from the very same institution, the very same texts, the very same anxious hands recording the sky night after night. It is worth remembering, finally, that the specific Babylonian fear of celestial omens extended even to interpreting the behavior of animals during unusual sky events: dogs howling, birds flying erratically, all carefully logged alongside the primary celestial observation itself, suggesting the anxiety this chapter describes bled outward to encompass the entire natural world's reaction, not simply the sky alone. It is worth remembering, one final time, that the fear this chapter describes was never purely abstract or philosophical for the people actually living inside it. A poorly interpreted omen could mean a delayed harvest, a canceled campaign, or a king suddenly hostile toward advisors he suspected of concealing bad news, genuinely practical stakes riding on what, to us, might look like pure superstition. Why did Egyptian architects, working with only copper tools, ramps, and raw human labor, orient the pyramids at Giza with a precision so exact that modern surveying equipment struggles to improve on it by more than a fraction of a degree? The three main pyramids at Giza are positioned in a pattern that closely mirrors the three stars of Orion's belt, a correlation first popularized in modern research by engineer Robert Bauval in the 1990s, and one that remains genuinely debated among Egyptologists regarding its intentionality and precise meaning. Whatever the full truth of that specific correlation, the broader astronomical intent behind the pyramid's orientation is far less contested. The Great Pyramid sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy of a fraction of 1 degree, an achievement that required careful, repeated stellar observation to accomplish without modern instruments. Egyptian religious texts, particularly the pyramid texts inscribed inside later Old Kingdom tombs, describe the pharaoh's soul ascending after death to join the imperishable stars, the circumpolar stars that never set below the horizon as seen from Egypt's latitude, and were therefore considered eternal. That belief carries real weight when you understand what it meant practically. A pharaoh was not simply hoping for a pleasant afterlife in some distant paradise. He was expected to become, quite literally, part of the permanent architecture of the night sky, watching over Egypt forever from among the stars that never disappeared. This obsession with celestial permanence was not disconnected from Egypt's more immediate, earthly survival concerns. Every single year, Egyptian civilization depended entirely on the Nile River flooding its banks, depositing the fertile silt that made agriculture in an otherwise desert environment possible at all. Egyptian priests noticed that the flood arrived with remarkable consistency around the same time each year that the star Sirius reappeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn, after months of being invisible, hidden below the sun's glare. They called this reappearance the heliacal rising of Sopdet. That single astronomical event effectively marked the Egyptian New Year and anchored their entire civil calendar. Predicting it correctly meant predicting, with real accuracy, the difference between agricultural abundance and famine for the coming year. Knowledge that valuable was never distributed casually. It lived inside temple walls, controlled by a priesthood that also managed land ownership, grain storage, and religious law simultaneously. Astronomy and raw political power occupied, quite literally, the same buildings. There's a genuinely unsettling detail buried inside all of this precision and reverence. Egyptian death culture treated the stars not as a distant metaphor for eternity, but as an actual physical destination, one that required exact architectural alignment to reach successfully. Temples and tombs were positioned with obsessive care towards specific solstice sunrises, specific stellar alignments, specific ritual windows tied directly to celestial timing. Getting the geometry wrong was not treated as a minor architectural inconvenience. It risked, according to their own religious framework, the pharaoh's soul actually failing to complete its journey among the eternal stars. Sit with that combination for a moment. Reverent devotion toward the stars, intense enough to move millions of tons of stone in a perfect geometric alignment with them, existing side by side with genuine, existential dread about what happens if that alignment fails. That is the emotional register running underneath nearly everything ancient Egypt built toward the sky. Not simple awe, something closer to reverent dread, the sense that the universe was watching very closely and that getting its rules wrong carried consequences that extended well beyond a single human lifetime. Egypt tied the stars to the eternal fate of its rulers after death. Several thousand miles east, along an entirely different river system, another civilization was about to tie the stars to something arguably more immediate and more dangerous. Whether a ruler was even allowed to keep governing while he was still alive. It is worth adding a note of genuine scholarly caution here, because Egyptology as a field has spent decades correcting overconfident popular claims about pyramid astronomy. Not every proposed stellar alignment holds up under rigorous statistical scrutiny, and some popular books have stretched thin correlations into far grander claims than the evidence actually supports. The true north alignment of the Great Pyramid, though, remains one of the least disputed and most impressive achievements, verified repeatedly by modern surveying. Achieving that kind of precision without a magnetic compass required patient observation of circumpolar stars over multiple nights, tracking their rotation to triangulate true north independent of magnetism entirely. That single, well-verified achievement is, on its own, worth more genuine awe than some of the more speculative claims layered on top of it over the decades. The ancient Egyptians did not need a lost, advanced civilization to explain their skill. Patient, disciplined observation, sustained over generations, was entirely sufficient. The labor required to achieve this precision deserves fuller accounting than popular retellings usually offer. Estimates for the Great Pyramid's construction suggest a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands, organized into rotating labor gangs, fed and housed in dedicated settlements whose remains archaeologists have since excavated near the pyramid site itself. That detail complicates an older, more romanticized narrative of slave labor that dominated popular imagination for much of the 20th century. The evidence instead points toward organized, arguably skilled labor, a genuine logistical achievement in feeding and housing a workforce this size across decades of continuous construction. It is also worth naming that Egyptian astronomy extended well beyond monumental alignment into everyday practical timekeeping. Priests divided the night into 12 hours marked by the rising of specific stars called decans, a system that, through a long chain of historical transmission, is a direct ancestor of the 24-hour day still used worldwide today. It is worth naming, finally, how genuinely contested the purpose of the pyramids remains even today among specialists, decades after their construction techniques were largely settled. Tombs, certainly. Astronomical instruments, likely, at least in part. But the full religious and political meaning encoded into their exact scale and placement continues to generate serious scholarly debate this documentary cannot fully resolve. Picture the pyramids not as the weathered ruins tourists photograph today, but as they actually appeared when new, cased entirely in polished white limestone that would have blazed almost painfully bright under the Egyptian sun, visible, according to some estimates, for many miles away across the surrounding desert. Consider, too, that Egyptian temples beyond Giza carried their own distinct astronomical alignments. The Temple of Karnak famously oriented toward the winter solstice sunrise, and the Temple of Abu Simbel engineered so that sunlight penetrates deep into its inner sanctuary to illuminate specific statues only twice a year. A level of architectural precision that still functions correctly more than 3,000 years later. There's a further detail worth naming about the mathematical sophistication required for the pyramid's internal design. The descending and ascending passages within the Great Pyramid appear aligned with specific stars at the time of construction, including what was then the pole star Thuban, a star that no longer holds that position today due to the precession this documentary discusses in later chapters. It is worth naming that Egyptian astronomical texts describe an organized system of star clocks used specifically for temple ritual timing at night, allowing priests to determine the correct hour for specific ceremonies even without daylight, a practical application of celestial knowledge considerably removed from the grander pyramid alignments this chapter has primarily focused on. Consider, finally, that Egyptian astronomical knowledge did not remain static across the civilization's roughly 3,000-year history, with later periods showing increasingly sophisticated star charts and improved precision in decant star tracking, evidence of continuous refinement rather than a single achievement frozen at its earliest, most famous moment. It is worth remembering, too, that Egyptian astronomical ceiling decorations, found in tombs such as that of Senenmut, depict remarkably detailed star charts and constellation figures, providing modern Egyptologists with valuable direct visual evidence of how ancient Egyptians actually organized and named the sky, distinct from and complementary to the textual evidence this chapter has primarily discussed. It is worth naming, too, that the specific engineering challenge of aligning a structure the size of the Great Pyramid to true north, without any of the surveying technology available today, required repeated nighttime observation sessions likely spread across an extended construction timeline, meaning the astronomical work itself was probably an ongoing collaborative project rather than a single, isolated moment of measurement. It is worth noting, finally, that Egypt's roughly 3,000-year civilizational continuity, considerably longer than the entire span separating ancient Rome from the present day, meant its astronomical traditions had unusually deep time to develop, refine, and calcify in a fixed religious doctrine, a genuinely rare historical circumstance among the civilizations this documentary has covered. It is worth remembering, finally, that the specific reverence this chapter describes towards stellar permanence would eventually be complicated by Hipparchus's later discovery, covered in a subsequent chapter, that even the fixed stars drift slowly over time, meaning the very stars Egyptian priests believed pharaohs joined forever were not, in fact, quite as permanently fixed as their entire death cult sincerely believed. It is worth remembering one absolute final time that everything this chapter has described, the alignment, the labor, the death cult, the reverence, was built by people working with copper chisels in their own hands, no iron tools, no wheels for heavy transport, no draft animals suited to the task, an achievement that remains genuinely difficult to fully explain even with everything modern archaeology has learned. What happens to an emperor, personally, the moment a bright, unexplained comet appears in the sky above his palace? In ancient China, that question was never abstract. It was a direct, public referendum on whether he still deserved to rule at all. Chinese political philosophy, developing across the Zhou dynasty and refined for millennia afterward, rested on a concept called the mandate of heaven, the belief that a ruler governed legitimately only for as long as heaven itself continued to approve of his conduct. Crucially, that approval was believed to be actively, continuously communicated through celestial signs, never something a ruler could simply assume he still held. Comets, eclipses, and what Chinese astronomers called guest stars, sudden bright new points of light appearing where none had existed before, were all read as heaven's direct commentary on the emperor's fitness to rule. A particularly ominous celestial event could be interpreted as a warning that the current dynasty's legitimacy was fading, providing rival claimants and rebels with a genuinely powerful propaganda tool, the sense that heaven itself had begun withdrawing its support. This created enormous, sustained pressure on the imperial court to track the sky with obsessive accuracy, and Chinese astronomers responded by producing what remains, even by modern standards, one of the most precise and continuous astronomical records in all of human history. That record's crowning achievement arrived in the year 1054, when Chinese court astronomers documented the sudden appearance of an extraordinarily bright guest star, visible even during daylight hours for roughly 3 weeks, before gradually fading over the following 2 years. Modern astronomers have since identified that event as a supernova, the catastrophic death explosion of a massive star, and traced its remnant directly to an object still visible today. The Crab Nebula, a glowing, expanding cloud of stellar debris roughly 6,500 light-years away. Without those precise Chinese court records, dated confidently to the exact year of the observation, modern astronomers would have a considerably harder time confirming the Crab Nebula's origin and age. Political anxiety about imperial legitimacy 1,000 years earlier had inadvertently produced genuinely valuable scientific data. That precision, though, came at a real human cost for the astronomers responsible for producing it. Court astronomers occupied one of the most anxiety-inducing positions available in the entire imperial bureaucracy, tasked with reporting celestial events that could carry devastating political implications for the very ruler they served. Historical records describe astronomers facing severe punishment, in some documented cases execution, for failing to predict eclipses accurately, for reporting unfavorable omens the emperor did not wish to hear, or, in certain periods, simply for being present when bad news needed a messenger. One often repeated, if historically disputed, account describes two royal astronomers, Shi and Ho, executed for failing to predict an eclipse, having reportedly been too drunk to perform their observational duties. Whether every detail of that particular story is strictly accurate, the underlying stakes it reflects were entirely real. Imagine holding that job for an entire career, every clear night, staring upward, knowing that whatever you honestly reported could reshape the political fate of an empire, and that reporting the wrong thing or reporting it poorly could just as easily reshape your own. This was not curiosity for its own sake. This was survival mathematics played out at the absolute highest level of state power, born from suffocating political fear rather than pure scientific wonder. And it produced, almost as an accidental byproduct, some of the finest astronomical record-keeping the ancient world ever achieved. Thousands of miles away, in a very different civilization entirely, another culture was developing a relationship with the sky that had almost nothing to do with political anxiety and almost everything to do with the concept of time, so vast it makes even 1,000 years of Chinese court records look, by comparison, almost trivially brief. It is worth naming a specific irony buried inside the Chinese system, one worth sitting with directly. The very precision that made Chinese court astronomy so scientifically valuable to us today was a direct byproduct of terror, not curiosity. Fear produced better data than wonder alone might have, an uncomfortable pattern that recurs across several civilizations in this documentary. Modern astrophysicists studying supernova remnants still routinely consult ancient Chinese, Korean, and Japanese court records when dating and characterizing historical stellar explosions, because East Asian court astronomy, driven by that same suffocating political anxiety, produced observational records considerably more consistent and detailed than most other contemporary civilizations managed to maintain. It is worth naming a specific irony sitting underneath this entire chapter. The very precision that makes Chinese court astronomy so scientifically valuable today was a direct byproduct of terror rather than curiosity, fear producing better data than pure wonder alone might ever have managed to sustain across so many centuries. Modern astrophysicists studying supernova remnants still routinely consult ancient Chinese, Korean, and Japanese court records when dating historical stellar explosions, because East Asian court astronomy, driven by that same suffocating political anxiety, produced observational records considerably more consistent than most contemporary civilizations managed to maintain elsewhere. It is worth naming the sheer administrative discipline this required across dynasties, an unbroken institutional memory stretching through invasions, succession crises, and centuries of upheaval. The astronomical watch continuing largely uninterrupted through nearly all of it, a genuinely remarkable feat of bureaucratic persistence. It is genuinely worth marveling at the sheer administrative discipline this required across generations of Chinese bureaucracy, an unbroken institutional memory stretching across dynasties, invasions, and centuries of political upheaval, the astronomical watch continuing, largely uninterrupted, through nearly all of it, a genuinely remarkable feat of sustained record-keeping. There's a further detail worth naming about how this system eventually influenced neighboring cultures. Korean and Japanese court astronomy developed along remarkably similar lines, adopting comparable systems of celestial omen interpretation tied to imperial legitimacy, evidence of how thoroughly this specific relationship between sky and sovereignty spread throughout East Asia over the centuries. Consider, too, how this mandate of heaven concept directly shaped succession politics within Chinese dynasties, providing rebels and usurpers with a ready-made ideological justification. A poor harvest or an inauspicious comet could be, and repeatedly was cited as evidence heaven had already withdrawn its favor for a reigning emperor, legitimizing revolt before a single battle was fought. There's a further detail worth naming about how Chinese astronomers distinguish between different categories of celestial anomaly with genuine taxonomic precision, maintaining separate classification systems for comets, novae, and other transient phenomena, an organizational rigor that allowed later astronomers and eventually modern historians to identify specific historical events with real confidence. It is worth naming that the specific 1054 supernova this chapter describes was also independently recorded by Japanese court astronomers and, according to some contested interpretations, may appear in rock art created by ancestral Puebloan communities in what is now the American Southwest, suggesting this singular celestial event was witnessed and recorded across multiple, entirely disconnected civilizations simultaneously. Consider, finally, that this Chinese astronomical tradition maintained remarkably consistent methodology across an extraordinary span of political change, the same basic observational and recording practices continuing through multiple dynasties, foreign conquests, and civil wars. Evidence of an institutional commitment to celestial record keeping that transcended any single ruling family's particular fortunes. It is worth remembering, too, that this Chinese astronomical tradition's precision extended to tracking sunspots as well, with Chinese records describing dark spots on the sun's surface centuries before European astronomers, using Galileo's telescope, would document the same phenomenon, achieved entirely through careful naked eye observation during specific atmospheric conditions that dimmed the sun's glare sufficiently. It is worth naming, too, that Chinese astronomers developed detailed classification systems for different comet tail shapes, associating specific visual characteristics with different predicted political and military outcomes, a level of interpretive granularity considerably more elaborate than the simpler, broader category systems found in most other ancient astrological traditions this documentary has described. It is worth noting, finally, that this Chinese imperial astronomical tradition persisted, in modified form, right up through the fall of the last imperial dynasty in 1912, meaning the basic institutional relationship between celestial observation and political legitimacy this chapter describes remained active, in some recognizable form, for well over 2,000 continuous years of Chinese history. It is worth remembering, finally, that this Chinese astronomical tradition's precision was sometimes weaponized in the opposite direction as well, ambitious court officials occasionally accused of fabricating or exaggerating unfavorable celestial reports specifically to undermine political rivals, meaning the system's genuine scientific rigor never fully eliminated the possibility of deliberate manipulation by those positioned to exploit it. It is worth remembering, one final time, that this documentary has now traced a nearly identical structural pattern across three entirely disconnected civilizations: Babylonian omen priests, Egyptian temple astronomers, and Chinese court officials, each independently arriving at the same basic arrangement of exclusive celestial knowledge, translating directly into exclusive political power, without any evidence these traditions ever directly influenced one another during their earliest formative periods. That fear never fully left. It simply changed its address, moving from temple to court to laboratory, always demanding someone stay awake and watch. What does it mean to believe, sincerely, as an ordinary fact about reality, that the universe has already died and been reborn more times than any human mind could ever hope to count? Ancient Vedic cosmology asked its followers to hold that belief comfortably. Hindu cosmological texts describe reality unfolding across vast cyclical units of time, called yugas, for distinct ages of progressively declining virtue and increasing chaos, cycling endlessly from a golden age of near perfection down to a dark, degraded final age called Kali Yuga. A complete cycle through all four yugas is called a Mahayuga, and traditional texts describe it lasting 4.32 million years. That number alone dwarfs the entire span of recorded human civilization several times over, and it is only the smallest unit in a considerably larger structure. 1,000 yugas together form a single kalpa, often described as a single day in the life of the god Brahma, lasting roughly 4.32 billion years, a figure that sits, remarkably, in the same rough order of magnitude as modern scientific estimates for the actual age of the Earth. That is a genuinely striking coincidence worth sitting with, without overstating it. It does not mean ancient Vedic scholars possessed modern astrophysical knowledge. It means, at minimum, that they arrived independently at a sense of truly vast cosmic time, thousands of years before Western science was willing to seriously entertain a universe anywhere near that old. Alongside this vast, cyclical cosmology, ancient India developed a sophisticated astrological tradition known as Jyotisha, meaning, roughly, the science of light. It combined careful astronomical observation with the belief that planetary positions at the moment of a person's birth genuinely shaped the course of their individual life. Jyotisha astrologers developed detailed systems for calculating planetary positions, lunar mansions called nakshatras, and complex birth charts still consulted by millions of practitioners today, a living tradition that has survived in continuous practice for well over 2,000 years. There's a genuine and interesting tension sitting at the heart of this worldview. On one hand, an individual human birth chart, tracked with careful precision, mattered enough to shape the details of one specific human life. On the other hand, that entire life was unfolding inside a kalpa lasting billions of years, itself just one day in the life of a single god among many. It is worth pausing here to directly compare this against everything covered so far in this documentary. Babylon's omens were urgent, immediate, tied to the fate of a specific king in a specific year. Egypt's stellar afterlife was eternal, but still fundamentally personal, tied to one pharaoh's individual soul. Vedic cosmology operates on a different emotional register entirely. Individual human concerns, even the concerns of kings and empires, become almost impossibly small when measured against cycles of time that stretch across billions of years and countless repeated cosmic deaths and rebirths. That is where a genuinely new kind of dread creeps into this documentary for the first time. Not fear of an angry god issuing a specific threat, something quieter, colder, and in some ways harder to sit with. The sense of being genuinely, mathematically insignificant against a backdrop of time too vast for any single human concern to register at all. It is a feeling that, centuries later, modern cosmology would eventually arrive at from an entirely different direction, through telescopes and physics rather than religious philosophy, and find remarkably similar in its emotional weight. We will return to that unsettling parallel later in this documentary. For now, though, we travel somewhere considerably more violent, to a civilization in Mesoamerica that responded to the terrifying vastness of the sky not with philosophical acceptance of cosmic insignificance, but with obsessive precision, ritual bloodshed, and war scheduled directly around the movements of a single, brilliant planet. It is worth adding some historical texture to Jyotisha's continuity, because it is easy to discuss ancient traditions as though they exist only in the past. Jyotisha consultations remain genuinely common across India today, influencing decisions around weddings, business openings, and significant life transitions, a living practice rather than a museum artifact. That continuity offers a useful preview of a theme this documentary returns to near its very end. Ancient sky beliefs rarely simply vanish. They persist, sometimes openly, sometimes buried invisibly inside habits and calendars nobody thinks to question anymore, threading directly from the ancient world into the choices people are still making today. It is worth adding some historical texture to Jyotisha's continuity, because it is easy to discuss ancient traditions as though they only exist in the past. Jyotisha consultations remain genuinely common across India today, influencing decisions around weddings, business openings, and major life transitions, a living practice rather than a museum artifact frozen in antiquity. There's a further detail worth naming about the sheer mathematical ambition of the Kalpa system. Vedic texts describe subdivisions of time reaching down to units lasting a fraction of a second, alongside units stretching across billions of years, an almost obsessive attempt to map the full scale of existence in both directions at once, from the nearly instantaneous to the nearly eternal. There is a further detail worth naming about the sheer mathematical ambition of the Kalpa system. Vedic texts describe subdivisions of time reaching down to units lasting a fraction of a second, alongside units stretching across billions of years, an almost obsessive attempt to map the full scale of existence in both directions at once. It is genuinely worth marveling at how differently this cosmology treats the individual human lifespan compared to nearly every other tradition covered in this documentary. A single human life, in this framework, is not simply short. It is statistically almost meaningless against the scale being described. And yet, Vedic tradition still treated individual conduct and karma as maturing enormously within that same vast, indifferent timescale. It is worth naming, too, how this Vedic cosmological framework interacted with practical daily life in ancient India beyond pure philosophical abstraction. Temple construction, agricultural timing, and major life ceremonies were all calibrated against this same vast cyclical calendar, meaning the incomprehensibly large kalpa and the very concrete planting season existed for practicing communities within a single unified system. Consider, too, how this Vedic conception of cyclical time influenced later Buddhist cosmology as it developed within the same broader Indian religious landscape, inheriting and adapting similar vast cyclical timescales while reframing their ultimate purpose around the possibility of liberation from the endless cycle altogether, rather than simple acceptance of its scale. There is a further detail worth naming about the specific astronomical calculations underlying Jyotisha practice, which require tracking the moon's position against a system of 27 lunar mansions called nakshatras, each associated with distinct mythological and personality characteristics. A considerably more granular division of the sky than the 12-sign zodiac, more familiar to Western astrological tradition. It is worth naming that ancient Indian astronomers, working within this broader Jyotisha tradition, made genuine independent contributions to mathematical astronomy as well, with the astronomer Aryabhata proposing in the 5th century that Earth rotates on its axis, a conclusion reached independently of, and centuries before, similar ideas gained serious traction in Europe. Consider, finally, that this Vedic tradition's vast cyclical cosmology has found unexpected resonance with certain modern cosmological models proposing cyclical universes that expand, contract, and begin again indefinitely, a genuinely striking parallel between ancient religious speculation and contemporary theoretical physics. Even though the two traditions arrived at broadly similar conclusions through entirely different methods. It is worth remembering, too, that this Vedic astronomical tradition produced sophisticated instruments of its own, including elaborate stone observatories, such as the later Jantar-Mandar complexes. Massive geometric structures designed for naked-eye astronomical measurement, with a level of precision that remained genuinely competitive with contemporary European instruments well into the 18th century. It is worth naming, too, that ancient Indian astronomical texts describe methods for calculating planetary positions using trigonometric functions that predate comparable European mathematical development by many centuries. The astronomer Brahmagupta, working in the 7th century, making significant independent contributions to both astronomy and the mathematical concept of zero as a number in its own right. It is worth noting, finally, that this Vedic tradition's astronomical and astrological knowledge spread well beyond India itself, influencing astronomical practice across Southeast Asia through trade and cultural exchange, a regional influence considerably less discussed in most Western histories of astronomy than the parallel Greek and Islamic traditions this documentary covers in greater depth elsewhere. It is worth remembering, finally, that this Vedic tradition of vast cyclical time offers a genuinely useful lens for revisiting nearly every other civilization covered in this documentary. Each culture's specific fears and obsessions, Babylonian omens, Egyptian mortality, Chinese political anxiety, appearing considerably smaller and more human-scaled when placed alongside a cosmology comfortable discussing billions of years as a single day. It is worth remembering, one absolute final time, that this vast Vedic timescale, despite its dizzying scope, was never treated by the tradition itself as a source of despair. Karma and individual moral conduct remain genuinely meaningful within this cosmology, suggesting vastness of scale and personal significance are not actually incompatible ideas, whatever intuition might initially suggest. Why would an entire empire deliberately schedule its wars, its raids, and its most important battles around the precise movements of a single planet visible in the morning and evening sky? For the ancient Maya, that was not superstition layered on top of politics. It was the actual operating system of the state. Venus, the second planet from the Sun, follows a distinctive and observable cycle from Earth's perspective, appearing as a brilliant morning star, then disappearing behind the Sun's glare, then re-emerging as an equally brilliant evening star, before disappearing again and restarting the pattern roughly every 584 days. Maya astronomers track that cycle with extraordinary precision, recording their observations and calculations in bark paper books, one of which survives today as the Dresden Codex, one of the only Maya manuscripts to escape destruction during the Spanish colonial conquest. The Dresden Codex contains detailed Venus tables, calculating the planet's heliacal risings, its periods of invisibility, and its full cycle with an accuracy that modern scholars have verified against contemporary astronomical calculations, finding an error of only a few hours across calculations spanning centuries. That level of precision, achieved without telescopes, without written numerals in the modern sense, using a base 20 counting system and generations of carefully recorded naked-eye observation, represents one of the genuine mathematical achievements of the ancient world. But the Maya were not tracking Venus purely out of scientific curiosity. Venus was closely associated with a war deity in Maya religious belief, and its heliacal rising, its dramatic reappearance in the sky after a period of invisibility, was treated as an auspicious, even mandatory, moment to launch military campaigns. Surviving inscriptions at multiple Maya city sites explicitly record military attacks timed to coincide with specific Venus events, a practice scholars have come to call Star War, referencing the deliberate scheduling of violence around this single planet's observable cycle. Rulers going to war under this framework were not simply making a strategic military decision. They were claiming divine sanction, timed and legitimized by the movement of a planet their entire society had spent generations learning to predict with near-perfect accuracy. Venus was also tied to ritual bloodletting practices, a form of religious sacrifice in which Maya nobility, including rulers themselves, would draw their own blood as an offering, oftentimes to specific astronomical events believed to require this particular kind of sacred nourishment. This should complicate any purely admiring version of Maya astronomical achievement, and it deserves to. The same civilization capable of calculating a planet's cycle to within a few hours across centuries was also organizing warfare and self-mutilation around those exact same calculations, treating precision and violence as fundamentally inseparable parts of the same religious system. The broader Maya calendar system, built from interlocking cycles, including the 260-day Tzolk'in and the 365-day Hab, demonstrates the same mathematical sophistication applied across nearly every aspect of daily and religious life, not simply warfare, tracking agricultural timing, religious ceremonies, and personal destiny with equal obsessive precision. Awe and violence, intertwined so completely that separating them would misrepresent the civilization that produced both. The Maya did not accidentally discover advanced astronomy despite their religious violence. In a genuine sense, the astronomy and the violence were built from the same underlying obsession with cosmic order and divine timing. Further south, and considerably later in Mesoamerican history, another civilization would take this exact relationship between astronomical precision and ritual bloodshed, somewhere even more extreme, driven by a genuinely terrifying core belief that the sun itself was mortal and would simply die unless it was continuously fed with human blood. It is worth naming plainly how the Dresden Codex actually survived at all, given how much Maya written material was deliberately destroyed. Spanish colonial authorities, particularly Bishop Diego de Landa in the 16th century, ordered the mass burning of Maya bark paper books, considering them idolatrous obstacles to religious conversion. Only 4 Maya codices are confirmed to have survived that campaign of destruction into the modern era, the Dresden Codex among them, apparently taken to Europe as a curiosity before the mass burnings, and only rediscovered in a Dresden library collection in the 18th century, centuries after most of its companion texts had already been reduced to ash. That should sit uncomfortably alongside everything else in this chapter. An entire library of Maya astronomical, historical, and religious knowledge, comparable in ambition to what this documentary already mourned at Alexandria, was destroyed deliberately within living memory of written European record-keeping by people who left behind a clear account of exactly why they did it. That should sit uncomfortably alongside everything else in this chapter. An entire library of Maya astronomical, historical, and religious knowledge, comparable in ambition to what this documentary later mourns at Alexandria, was destroyed deliberately within living memory of written European record-keeping by people who left behind a clear account of exactly why they did it. It is worth naming the specific mathematical technique Maya astronomers used to correct for accumulated error across their long-term Venus tables, a correction formula found within the Dresden Codex itself, adjusting the calculated cycle slightly to keep predictions accurate across periods spanning multiple human generations of continuous observation and recording. That correction detail matters because it proves this was not simply a fixed, static table copied unchanged for centuries. Maya astronomers were actively refining their own calculations over time, comparing predictions against fresh observation, and adjusting accordingly, the same iterative discipline this documentary described in Babylon centuries earlier and continents away. It is worth naming, too, how the Maya calendar's long count system, distinct from its Tzolk'in and Hab cycles already discussed, allowed for tracking dates across truly vast spans of time into the deep past and far future, a mathematical achievement requiring a genuinely sophisticated understanding of large number systems well before comparable concepts developed independently elsewhere. Consider, too, that Maya astronomers tracked not only Venus, but also carefully documented Mars and Jupiter's movements, recording their positions in relation to specific constellations the Maya associated with agricultural and ritual significance. a comprehensive planetary tracking system rivaling in ambition, though developed in complete isolation from the parallel Babylonian tradition thousands of miles away. There is a further detail worth naming about how Maya astronomical knowledge was physically encoded into their architecture beyond the Dresden Codex alone. The observatory structure at Chichen Itza, known as El Caracol, features windows precisely aligned with the extreme positions of Venus's rising and setting points, allowing priests to track the planet's cycle directly through the building's own architecture. It is worth naming that Maya mathematics included an independently developed concept of zero, represented by a distinctive shell-shaped glyph, a genuinely sophisticated mathematical innovation that arose separately from, and in some respects earlier than, the zero concept's development in India, underscoring just how mathematically advanced this civilization's astronomical calculations actually were. Consider, finally, that Maya astronomical knowledge continued to be practiced and refined well after the classic period city collapse this documentary mentions elsewhere, with post-classic Maya communities maintaining active astronomical observation and calendar keeping right up until the Spanish conquest violently interrupted that continuous tradition in the 16th century. It is worth remembering, too, that Maya astronomers achieved genuine precision in calculating the solar year as well, arriving at a figure remarkably close to the modern measured value, achieved through the same patient, generational observational discipline this documentary has described across nearly every civilization it has covered. Proof of a shared human capacity for precision regardless of geography or available technology. It is worth naming, too, that Maya astronomical observatories were often deliberately integrated into ball court complexes and other ceremonial architecture, suggesting astronomical observation, religious ritual, and civic life were not treated as separate categories of activity at all, but as different facets of a single, unified understanding of how the cosmos and society were meant to function together. It is worth noting, finally, that Maya astronomical achievement occurred within city-states that, unlike the centralized empires of Egypt or China, remained politically fragmented and often in direct competition with one another, meaning this remarkable astronomical sophistication developed through a decentralized network of independent scholarly traditions rather than a single unified imperial astronomical bureaucracy. It is worth remembering, finally, that Maya astronomical texts describe not just Venus, but a comprehensive tracking system for eclipse prediction as well. The Dresden Codex, containing eclipse tables demonstrating an independently developed predictive capability broadly comparable in ambition, though not in specific method, to the Babylonian Saros cycle this documentary describes in a later chapter. It is worth remembering, one final time, that the sheer violence embedded within Maya astronomical practice should not be read as somehow uniquely bloodthirsty compared to other civilizations this documentary covers, ritual warfare and human sacrifice appearing, in different forms and different intensities, across a genuinely wide range of ancient cultures whenever cosmic anxiety reached a sufficiently extreme pitch. What does a civilization do, systematically, generation after generation, when it sincerely believes the sun itself is mortal, fragile, and will simply stop rising unless it is continuously fed with human blood? The Aztec Empire built its entire cosmology and much of its state violence directly around that belief. Central to Aztec religious belief was the mythology of the five suns, a cyclical creation story describing four previous cosmic ages, each one ending in a different catastrophic destruction, and each requiring the gods themselves to sacrifice something essential to bring the next sun, the next age, into existence. According to this mythology, the current fifth sun, the one illuminating the present age, was created through the gods' own self-sacrifice at the ancient city of Teotihuacan, and it remained, by its very nature, unstable and perpetually at risk of ending, just as the four suns before it had ended. That instability was not treated as a distant, abstract theological concern, It was treated as an active, ongoing crisis requiring continuous human intervention. The sun, in this belief system, needed regular nourishment in the form of human sacrifice, specifically blood and hearts, to maintain enough strength to complete its daily journey across the sky. This belief directly shaped Aztec state structure and military policy. Warfare, including a specific ritualized form called the Flower Wars, was conducted partly with the explicit purpose of capturing prisoners for later sacrifice, treating military conquest and religious obligation as two faces of the exact same underlying necessity. At the center of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, stood the Templo Mayor, a massive step pyramid serving simultaneously as a religious center, a site of large-scale ritual sacrifice, and, crucially for this documentary, a carefully engineered astronomical observatory. The Templo Mayor's dual staircase and twin temple structure was deliberately oriented so that, on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the rising sun would appear to emerge directly from the narrow gap between its two temples, viewed from a specific vantage point along the causeway leading into the sacred precinct. That alignment required exactly the same kind of obsessive, long-term astronomical observation and mathematical planning that produced the Maya Venus tables or the Egyptian alignment with Sirius. The engineering achievement is real, and it deserves genuine recognition, sitting uncomfortably alongside the violence it was built to serve. Spanish colonial accounts, written after the conquest and requiring real historiographical caution given their colonizing authors' clear motives to justify conquest, nonetheless align with substantial independent archaeological evidence confirming large-scale ritual sacrifice occurred at Aztec religious sites, including excavated skull racks and sacrificial remains at the Templo Mayor itself. It would be a genuine mistake to treat this practice as simple, mindless brutality disconnected from serious intellectual achievement. Aztec priests maintained detailed calendrical systems, the 260-day Tanalpwali and the 365-day Xiapawali, tracking astronomical and ritual timing with real mathematical sophistication. That sophistication was placed deliberately and consistently in service of a worldview built on genuine, sincere terror, not metaphorical terror. A society organizing its most talented mathematicians, architects, and priests around the literal, urgent fear that failing to act correctly would end the sun, and with it, the entire world. This is deliberately presented as the darkest sky belief covered anywhere in this documentary, and it deserves to be sat with honestly rather than sanitized. Horror and devotion in Aztec cosmology were never separate categories. They were the same religious impulse, wearing the same face, pointed at the same trembling, mortal sun. It is worth taking a breath here because this documentary is about to move somewhere considerably gentler. Not every ancient relationship with the night sky was built from terror and blood. Some cultures used the exact same stars as a working, practical tool, one that carried its own life for death stakes, but none of the ritual horror we have just walked through. It is worth adding one further layer of complexity to the Aztec picture, because the more recent archaeological consensus complicates some of the older, more sensationalized colonial-era accounts. Scholars now believe the scale of sacrifice reported by early Spanish chroniclers was likely exaggerated, deliberately in some cases, to help justify the brutality of the conquest itself. That correction does not erase the underlying practice, which archaeological evidence independently confirms did occur. It simply means the true picture sits somewhere more complicated than either the breathless colonial horror stories or a fully sanitized modern defense. Attention historians continue actively working through with each new excavation. There is a further detail worth naming about the Templo Mayor's construction history. Archaeologists have determined the structure was rebuilt and expanded across at least 7 distinct phases, each new Aztec ruler adding another layer atop the last, meaning the equinox alignment this chapter describes was likely refined and recalibrated repeatedly across generations of successive rulers. It is genuinely worth marveling at how much continuity this layered rebuilding actually preserved. Despite each new ruler adding to the structure, the fundamental astronomical alignment toward the equinox sunrise remained consistent across every rebuilding phase, suggesting the underlying astronomical knowledge itself was carefully protected and transmitted even as the physical monument above it kept changing shape. It is worth naming, too, that Aztec astronomy extended beyond solar and Venus tracking into careful observation of the Pleiades star cluster, whose position at midnight marked the beginning of a 52-year cycle called the New Fire Ceremony, a ritual renewal so significant that all fires across the empire were reportedly extinguished and relit from a single new flame. Consider, too, that Aztec cosmology divided the universe into 13 heavens above and 9 underworlds below, each level associated with specific deities and astronomical phenomena, an intricately layered cosmic architecture considerably more elaborate than the simpler sky and underworld divisions found in many other ancient belief systems this documentary has covered. There is a further detail worth naming about the broader Mesoamerican calendar system the Aztecs inherited and adapted from earlier civilizations, including the Olmec and later Maya traditions, demonstrating that this sophisticated astronomical and calendrical knowledge was not an isolated Aztec invention, but the culmination of well over 1,000 years of accumulated regional astronomical development. It is worth naming that Aztec astronomers maintained careful records of eclipse cycles as well, integrated within their broader ritual calendar, treating solar eclipses with particular alarm given their cosmology's existing anxiety about the sun's fundamental instability. An eclipse read within this framework as direct, visible evidence that the sun's ongoing survival could genuinely not be taken for granted. Consider, finally, that Aztec astronomical and calendrical knowledge, despite the destruction described elsewhere in this documentary, survived in fragmentary form through indigenous scribes trained by early colonial missionaries, some of whom secretly preserved pre-conquest knowledge within documents nominally created to serve entirely different colonial administrative purposes. It is worth remembering, too, that Aztec society maintained a specialized class of astronomer priests called Tonalpuk, whose specific responsibility was interpreting the sacred calendar and advising on auspicious timing for major decisions, a role directly comparable to the Babylonian astrologer priests and Chinese court astronomers this documentary described in earlier chapters. The same basic social function recurring across an entirely unconnected civilization. It is worth naming, too, that Aztec cosmological belief extended to careful observation of planetary conjunctions as well, particular alignments between Venus and other visible planets treated as especially significant omens requiring specific ritual response, evidence of an astronomical sophistication considerably more nuanced than a simple, singular fixation on the Sun and Venus alone might suggest. It is worth noting, finally, that the Aztec Empire itself existed for a remarkably brief period historically, roughly 2 centuries before Spanish conquest, meaning the elaborate astronomical and religious system this chapter describes represented a rapid, intense civilizational achievement rather than the product of the multi-millennial gradual development seen in Egypt or China. It is worth remembering, finally, that the specific horror this chapter describes, a civilization organizing itself around feeding a mortal sun, should be understood within its own internal logic as a genuinely coherent response to genuine cosmic anxiety, not simply irrational cruelty, the same underlying fear of cosmic instability this documentary has traced from its very first chapter, taken here to its most extreme practical conclusion. It is worth remembering one absolute final time that the Templo Mayor itself was completely destroyed by Spanish conquistadors following the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, its stones repurposed to build the very colonial cathedral that still stands atop the site today, a physical, literal burial of one civilization's relationship with the sky beneath the foundations of the belief system that replaced it. How did sailors, working with no compass, no sextant, no written charts of any kind, cross literally thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean using nothing but memorized star paths, ocean swells, and generations of carefully passed down oral knowledge? Polynesian wayfinding represents one of the most sophisticated navigational systems developed anywhere in the ancient world, allowing settlement of an oceanic region spanning roughly 10 million square miles, from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island, centuries before European sailors dared to venture far from visible coastlines. At the center of this system sat what navigators call the star compass, a mental framework dividing the horizon into distinct houses, each one associated with specific stars that reliably rise or set at that particular point along the horizon. A skilled navigator memorized the rising and setting points of dozens of stars, tracking which one to follow as an earlier guide star climbed too high in the sky to reliably indicate direction, seamlessly transitioning attention to the next star in a chain, hour after hour, throughout an entire night. When clouds obscured the stars, as they inevitably did for stretches of any long voyage, navigators relied on a secondary, equally sophisticated skill, reading the direction and pattern of ocean swells, distinguishing between swells generated by local wind and deeper, more consistent swells traveling from distant, permanent weather systems. Additional signals supplemented this system further. The flight patterns of specific seabirds, known to range a certain distance from land before returning to roost, could indicate a navigator was approaching an island still below the visible horizon. Cloud formations sometimes revealed the presence of land reflected in their color and shape. This entire body of knowledge was preserved and transmitted almost entirely through oral tradition, passed from master navigators to apprentices across years of hands-on training at sea, with no written charts to fall back on if memory failed at a critical moment. The stakes involved in this system were genuinely, immediately life or death, in a way that distinguishes it sharply from most of the astronomical traditions covered elsewhere in this documentary. A Babylonian priest who misjudged an omen risked political consequences. A Polynesian navigator who misjudged a star bearing risked the death of everyone aboard the canoe from thirst, starvation, or simply being lost at sea with no possibility of rescue. This tradition nearly vanished entirely during the 20th century, as Western navigational technology and colonial disruption of traditional Pacific societies interrupted the direct chain of teaching between generations of master navigators. It was substantially revived starting in the 1970s, largely credited to a Micronesian master navigator named Mau, who taught traditional wayfinding techniques to a new generation of Polynesian sailors, most famously aboard the voyaging canoe Hokulia, which successfully sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti in 1976 using no modern navigational instruments. That successful voyage proved, in front of a skeptical modern audience, that traditional wayfinding was not primitive guesswork dressed up in cultural mythology. It was a rigorous, teachable, demonstrably functional navigational science, developed independently and refined over many centuries of open ocean voyaging. This chapter offers something genuinely different from nearly everything else in this documentary so far. Not the sky as an omen to be feared, not a tool of political or religious control, but a working, practical, deeply respected body of knowledge, oriented entirely toward survival and connection rather than domination or dread. It is worth letting that brief tonal shift breathe for a moment, because the documentary is about to turn considerably more analytical and, in its own way, considerably more radical. Somewhere in ancient Greece, a handful of thinkers were about to do something almost nobody in the ancient world had seriously attempted before. Insist that the eclipse god theory be tested, measured, and, if necessary, discarded. It is worth naming how genuinely difficult it was to relearn this navigational tradition once it had nearly been lost. Pielug himself came from one of the very few Pacific islands, Satawal in the Caroline Islands, where traditional wayfinding had never fully been interrupted, making him an almost singular living link back to an unbroken chain of knowledge. Teaching that knowledge to Hawaiian sailors in the 1970s required Pielug to essentially translate an entire embodied oral tradition across a real cultural and linguistic gap, a reminder that this kind of knowledge does not transfer easily through books or lectures. It requires years direct mentorship, and the sea itself as the only truly reliable classroom. There's a further detail worth naming about the specific stakes involved in relearning this tradition. When the Hokulia first set sail in 1976 with no modern instruments aboard, considerable public skepticism existed about whether traditional wayfinding could genuinely work at open ocean scale, or whether it represented a romanticized cultural memory that could not actually survive a real, unforgiving test. It is genuinely worth marveling at how directly this successful voyage reshaped academic attitudes toward oral tradition more broadly, encouraging researchers across multiple disciplines to take seriously bodies of knowledge that had previously been dismissed, sometimes casually, as folklore rather than legitimate, rigorous, testable science. It is worth naming, too, that Polynesian navigational knowledge extended beyond stars and swells into detailed understanding of migratory bird patterns, cloud formations reflecting lagoon colors from below, and even the specific taste and temperature variations of ocean water near different island chains, an entire integrated sensory science built from patient, multi-generational observation. Consider, too, that Polynesian double-hulled voyaging canoes, the actual vessels carrying this navigational knowledge across the Pacific, represented their own remarkable engineering achievement, capable of carrying dozens of people along with sufficient food, water, and breeding stock of plants and animals to found entirely new settlements thousands of miles from their point of departure. There's a further detail worth naming about how this Polynesian navigational tradition handled the genuine risk of catastrophic error. Voyaging canoes typically carried enough provisions for extended searches, and navigators developed techniques for expanding their search areas systematically if an expected landfall did not appear on schedule, a built-in margin for the acknowledged uncertainty even the most skilled wayfinder faced. It is worth naming that this Polynesian wayfinding tradition also encompassed sophisticated understanding of ocean currents distinct from swell patterns. Navigators tracking subtle differences in water temperature and even distinctive phosphorescence patterns at night, an entire additional sensory layer of open ocean expertise built on top of the star and swell knowledge already described. Consider, finally, that this Polynesian navigational tradition's geographic reach, spanning roughly 10 million square miles of open ocean, remains one of the largest sustained zones of human expansion and settlement achieved by any culture prior to the modern era, accomplished entirely without metal tools, written language, or any instrument beyond careful, disciplined human observation. It is worth remembering, too, that Polynesian star compass knowledge was traditionally taught through structured, formalized instruction involving memorized chants and songs, an oral pedagogical technique that allowed complex navigational information to be reliably transmitted and retained across generations without any written record whatsoever, a genuinely sophisticated educational technology in its own right. It is worth naming, too, that this Polynesian navigational achievement required not just individual skill, but entire supporting communities capable of building and provisioning voyaging canoes, growing and preserving food for extended journeys, and maintaining the social structures necessary to organize and support these expeditions. A genuinely collective technological and social achievement rather than a purely individual one. It is worth noting, finally, that Polynesian settlement of the Pacific occurred in distinct historical waves over roughly 3,000 years, with the most remote islands, including New Zealand and Easter Island, only reached within the last 1,000 years, meaning this navigational tradition was still actively expanding its geographic reach well into what Europeans consider their own medieval period. It is worth remembering, finally, that this Polynesian wayfinding tradition's revival in the 1970s directly coincided with a broader cultural renaissance across the Pacific, indigenous language, art, and governance movements gaining momentum alongside the navigational revival, suggesting the recovery of this specific technical knowledge was part of a considerably larger reclamation of cultural identity and self-determination. It is worth remembering, one final time, that this chapter offers this documentary its only genuinely unambiguous moment of pure human triumph. No violence, no priesthood monopolizing knowledge for political gain, simply patient mastery placed directly in service of survival and connection between scattered island communities separated by thousands of miles of open, indifferent ocean. What happens the very first time someone, in a world that has explained the sky through gods and omens for as far back as anyone can remember, insists that the eclipse god theory must actually be tested, measured, and checked against evidence? That shift began, according to ancient sources, with a merchant and thinker from the Greek city of Miletus named Thales, working in the 6th century before our era. At roughly the same period, Babylonian astrology was reaching its own peak of sophistication half a world away. Ancient historians, most notably Herodotus writing a century later, credit Thales with predicting a solar eclipse that occurred in 585 BCE, reportedly interrupting a battle between the Lydians and the Medes so dramatically that both sides immediately laid down their weapons and negotiated peace. Modern historians of science genuinely debate how precisely Thales could have predicted that specific eclipse using the astronomical knowledge available at the time, and some caution against overstating his methods. But the underlying claim being made about him is, itself, historically significant regardless of the technical details. For the very first time in the surviving historical record, a thinker was being credited with predicting an eclipse in advance, based on some form of pattern recognition or calculation, rather than simply interpreting it as a divine message after the fact. That distinction, prediction through pattern rather than interpretation through faith, is genuinely radical, even if Thales' specific methods remain uncertain to modern scholars. It quietly implies the sky operates according to discoverable rules, rather than the unpredictable, personal whims of gods issuing warnings when they feel like it. A generation or two later, Pythagoras and the philosophical school that grew up around his teachings proposed something equally significant, that the Earth itself was spherical, not flat, based partly on observations like the curved shadow Earth casts on the moon during a lunar eclipse. That is worth sitting with directly. A civilization capable of noticing the shape of a shadow during an eclipse and reasoning correctly from that shadow to the actual physical shape of the planet beneath their feet was doing something categorically different from reading the same eclipse as a divine omen requiring ritual appeasement. Anaximander, another thinker from Miletus working in Thales' general circle, went further still, proposing early cosmological models that attempted to explain the sizes and distances of celestial bodies through reasoned argument and rough proportional calculation, rather than mythological narrative. His specific numbers were wrong, sometimes dramatically wrong by modern measurement. That is almost beside the point. What mattered was the underlying method. Propose a model, reason through its implications, accept that the model might be revised or to discard it entirely if better reasoning or evidence came along. This shift did not happen quickly, and it did not happen without real resistance and genuine danger for the people proposing it. Greek natural philosophers who proposed ideas conflicting with traditional religious belief faced real social and sometimes legal consequences, a pattern that would recur, far more violently, in later centuries and other civilizations covered in this documentary. The philosopher Anaxagoras, working slightly later in the 5th century BCE, was reportedly prosecuted in Athens for impiety, in significant part because he proposed that the sun was not a god, but a burning mass of stone, roughly the size of the Peloponnese Peninsula. That should tell you something important about how quietly dangerous this early rebellion actually was. Separating celestial explanation from religious narrative was not a comfortable academic exercise conducted safely from a distance. It carried real, personal risk, planted directly against the authority of inherited belief in a culture that took that belief seriously. From this point forward, this documentary moves from mythology toward mathematics, though never entirely leaving mythology behind, because the two would remain tangled together in different combinations for many centuries still to come. The next major leap in that mathematical direction did not happen in Greece at all. It happened back in Babylon, where scribes were quietly perfecting something that would turn the ancient world's most terrifying event into a scheduled, predictable occurrence. It is worth naming, honestly, that this documentary's framing of a clean turning point risks oversimplifying a messier reality. Greek natural philosophy did not simply replace religious cosmology in one clean movement. Most Greek philosophers, Aristotle very much included, continued to describe the heavens in explicitly theological terms, populated by divine, purposeful intelligence guiding the celestial spheres. What genuinely changed was not a wholesale rejection of divinity in the sky. It was the introduction of a new expectation that claims about the sky, divine or otherwise, ought to be defensible through observation and reasoned argument, open in principle to challenge and revision, rather than simply asserted on inherited authority alone. It is worth naming how genuinely difficult it was for these early Greek thinkers to fully escape the mythological framework they were working to challenge. Even Anaximander, proposing a rationalist cosmological model, still described the origin of the universe using the term apeiron, the boundless, a concept that retained clear traces of mythic, quasi-divine language, even while attempting genuine natural philosophy. That blending, rational method wrapped in language still borrowed from myth is worth remembering whenever this documentary risks presenting too clean a break between mythology and reason. The transition was never a light switch. It was a slow, uneven negotiation between two ways of explaining the world that continued influencing each other for centuries afterward. It is worth naming, too, how genuinely radical Anaxagoras' claim about the sun actually was within its own historical context. Proposing the sun was a burning rock rather than a god was not simply an alternative scientific hypothesis in the modern sense. It was a direct challenge to the religious foundation an entire society organized its civic and moral life around. Consider, too, that Pythagoras' own school treated its astronomical and mathematical discoveries with genuine secrecy, reportedly binding members to silence about certain findings, meaning even this earliest rationalist tradition retains some of the same restrictive, insider knowledge structure this documentary has criticized in Babylonian and Egyptian priesthoods, just wearing a philosophical rather than religious justification. There is a further detail worth naming about how Thales's broader intellectual legacy extended beyond astronomy into what later Greek tradition considered the founding of natural philosophy itself, proposing that water was the fundamental substance underlying all matter, an idea that seems primitive today but represented a genuine attempt to explain physical reality through natural principles rather than divine will. It is worth naming that this early Greek natural philosophy tradition also produced Democritus, working roughly a century after Thales, who proposed that all matter, including celestial bodies, consisted of indivisible atoms moving through empty space, an idea remarkably close in spirit to modern atomic theory, though arrived at through pure reasoned speculation rather than experimental evidence. Consider, finally, that this early Greek rationalist tradition, despite its genuine intellectual courage, remained a minority position even within Greek society itself. most ordinary Greeks continuing to consult oracles and interpret omens through traditional religious channels throughout this entire period. A reminder that intellectual revolutions rarely represent the majority view of the society that eventually claims credit for producing them. It is worth remembering, too, that this early Greek tradition of natural philosophy eventually produced Empedocles, who proposed the theory of four fundamental elements: earth, air, fire, and water, later adopted and expanded by Aristotle into the broader cosmological framework this documentary describes in considerable depth within its companion piece on humanity's obsession with space. It is worth naming, too, that this early period of Greek natural philosophy also produced Xenophanes, who explicitly criticized the anthropomorphic depiction of gods in earlier Greek mythology, arguing that different cultures simply imagined their gods to resemble themselves. An early and genuinely striking piece of comparative religious and cultural criticism embedded within broader cosmological speculation. It is worth noting, finally, that this early Greek philosophical tradition developed within a specifically political context of relatively decentralized city-states, rather than a single unified empire. A fragmented political landscape that some historians argue actually encouraged the kind of open intellectual competition and debate this documentary has described as essential to the rationalist shift away from purely mythological explanation. It is worth remembering, finally, that this chapter's turning point did not happen in isolation from the broader civilizational currents this documentary has already traced. Greek natural philosophy emerged directly alongside considerable exposure to Babylonian, Egyptian, and Phoenician knowledge through Mediterranean trade, meaning even this celebrated moment of rational rebellion was itself built on foundations borrowed from exactly the priesthoods it was quietly beginning to challenge. It is worth remembering one absolute final time that this chapter represents this documentary's single clearest turning point, deliberately marked in its own title, and everything that follows across the remaining 10 chapters. Mathematical prediction precession, the Antikythera mechanism itself, flows directly from the fragile intellectual courage described here. A handful of thinkers willing to ask whether the eclipse god theory actually held up. What does it mean for an entire society when the single most terrifying event in the ancient sky, the eclipse, becomes something scribes can schedule in advance, on a clay tablet, months or even years before it actually happens? By the later centuries of Babylonian civilization, roughly the 5th through 1st centuries before our era, astronomer scribes had achieved something genuinely remarkable: consistent, mathematically grounded prediction of lunar eclipses, and increasingly reliable prediction of solar eclipses and planetary positions as well. This achievement rested on a discovery known as the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours, after which the Sun, Moon, and Earth returned to closely similar relative positions, causing eclipses to repeat in a predictable, recurring pattern. Babylonian astronomers did not understand the Saros cycle through the physical, mechanical model we use today, planets orbiting the Sun according to gravity. They discovered it empirically through centuries of patient, meticulous observation, noticing that eclipse patterns repeated after this specific interval, and building predictive tables from that observed regularity alone. That distinction matters enormously. This was not theoretical physics in the modern sense. It was applied, disciplined pattern recognition, refined across roughly 1,000 years of continuous record-keeping, arguably the single longest sustained scientific research project in the ancient world. Surviving cuneiform tablets, particularly from the later Babylonian and Seleucid periods, show increasingly sophisticated mathematical techniques, including methods resembling what modern mathematicians would recognize as arithmetic progressions, used to predict not just eclipses, but the changing daily motion of the moon and planets across the sky. This growing predictive power carried a genuinely significant social consequence, one worth connecting directly back to earlier chapters of this documentary. Recall the anxious court astrologers of Chapter 3, delivering urgent, fearful warnings about Venus disappearing from the sky, their authority resting on interpreting unpredictable divine messages. As eclipses and planetary movements became increasingly predictable through calculation, the nature of astronomical authority began quietly shifting. Power moved, gradually, away from those who claimed special access to interpreting unpredictable divine will toward those who could simply do the mathematics correctly and reliably. That is a genuinely significant historical hinge point, even if it unfolded slowly and unevenly over centuries rather than as a single dramatic break. Prediction does not eliminate fear entirely, but it does begin to domesticate it, converting a sudden, terrifying ambush into a scheduled, anticipated event that a community can prepare for calmly in advance. This Babylonian mathematical tradition did not stay confined to Mesopotamia. It traveled through trade, conquest, and scholarly exchange, particularly following Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century BCE, which brought Greek and Babylonian intellectual traditions into direct, sustained contact for the first time. Greek astronomers absorbed and built directly on Babylonian observational data and mathematical techniques, a debt that later Greek scholars, including figures we will meet in the coming chapters, openly acknowledged, even as Greek astronomy developed its own distinctive geometric and theoretical framework alongside the inherited Babylonian numbers. It is worth resisting the temptation to frame this as a clean, triumphant story of religious fear giving way permanently to rational science. Astrology, omen interpretation, and mathematical prediction continued to coexist, often within the very same individual scholars, for many centuries still to come. The line between them was never as sharp in practice as it can appear from this historical distance. But the underlying trajectory is real, and it represents a genuine, hard-won shift in how humans related to the terrifying unpredictability that opened this documentary's very first chapter. The eclipse that once sent entire cities into screaming panic was becoming, for those with access to the right calculations, simply another entry on a calendar. That growing mathematical confidence was about to encounter a genuine surprise, though, one that would unsettle an assumption almost every civilization covered so far had shared without question. That whatever else changed in the sky, the background positions of the fixed stars themselves remained permanently, eternally unchanging. It is worth naming a specific mathematical tool the Babylonians developed that rarely gets proper credit outside specialist circles. They pioneered what modern historians call zigzag functions, mathematical models tracking a quantity that rises and falls in a repeating, roughly linear pattern, used specifically to predict the changing daily speed of the moon and planets across the sky. That approach, purely arithmetic, with no underlying geometric model of orbits or physical causes at all, represents a genuinely different scientific philosophy than the geometric models Greek astronomers would later favor. Predict the pattern accurately, and worry considerably less about explaining the underlying mechanism producing it. It is genuinely worth marveling at how quickly this predictive Babylonian mathematics traveled once contact with Greek scholarship opened, particularly following Alexander's conquests, with Greek astronomers absorbing Babylonian numerical data within roughly a generation or two of sustained cultural contact, an unusually fast transmission for the ancient world. It is worth naming, too, how this Babylonian mathematical tradition eventually influenced calendar systems well beyond astronomy itself. The base 60 numerical system underlying much of their astronomical calculations survives today in how we divide hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds, a direct, largely unnoticed inheritance from Babylonian scribes working roughly 3,000 years ago. Consider, too, that this predictive Babylonian tradition eventually produced something resembling a genuine research institution, with specific temples serving as dedicated centers for astronomical training and record keeping across multiple generations, an early institutional model for organized scientific inquiry that predates anything comparable in the Greek world by centuries. There is a further detail worth naming about the specific scribal training required to master this Babylonian mathematical astronomy, involving years of apprenticeship learning cuneiform notation, arithmetic technique, and observational method, an educational pathway with genuine parallels to how modern graduate students train for careers in scientific research today. It is worth naming that this Babylonian predictive tradition extended beyond eclipses and planetary motion into attempts at weather forecasting as well, correlating celestial patterns with anticipated rainfall and agricultural conditions, an ambitious, if considerably less reliable, extension of the same basic instinct to find predictable pattern within an unpredictable natural world. Consider, finally, that this Babylonian mathematical astronomical tradition reached its peak of sophistication during the Seleucid period, after Alexander's conquest had already brought Greek administrators into direct contact with Babylonian scholars, suggesting the cross-cultural exchange this chapter describes may have flowed in both directions simultaneously. Greek mathematics potentially influencing late Babylonian methods, even as Babylonian data flowed the other way. It is worth remembering, too, that Babylonian mathematical astronomy's predictive tables required an enormous, sustained collaborative effort across generations of scribes, each building directly on records compiled by predecessors they never personally met, a genuinely early example of cumulative, multi-generational scientific progress functioning much the way modern research institutions operate today. It is worth naming, too, that this Babylonian predictive tradition's accuracy was regularly tested against reality in the most direct way possible. An eclipse either occurred on the predicted date or it did not, providing scribes with immediate, unambiguous feedback about their method's reliability. A built-in accountability mechanism considerably more rigorous than many other ancient systems of interpretive knowledge. It is worth noting, finally, that this Babylonian mathematical astronomical tradition effectively ended with the region's absorption into successive empires, Persian, Greek, and eventually Parthian rule, the last known cuneiform astronomical text dating to around the 1st century of our era, quietly closing out a written astronomical tradition that had continued, in some form, for well over 3,000 years. It is worth remembering, finally, that this Babylonian mathematical astronomical achievement occurred entirely without the concept of zero as a placeholder digit in the way modern positional notation uses it, Babylonian scribes instead relying on context and spacing to indicate absent values, a genuinely striking limitation that makes their mathematical achievements even more impressive given the tools they were actually working with. What happens when an astronomer, working carefully through old observational records, realizes that even the so-called fixed stars, the ones every civilization covered in this documentary had assumed were permanently, eternally locked in place, are actually slowly drifting? That discovery is credited to Hipparchus, a Hellenistic astronomer working primarily on the island of Rhodes during the 2nd century before our era, widely considered one of the greatest observational astronomers of the ancient world. Hipparchus compared his own careful stellar observations against older astronomical records, some reaching back over a century earlier, and noticed something that should not have been possible under the prevailing assumption of a perfectly fixed celestial sphere. The positions of certain stars, measured relative to the equinox points, had shifted. That shift is now understood as the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's own rotational axis, similar to the wobble of a spinning top gradually slowing down, causing the position of the equinox points against the background stars to shift gradually over a cycle lasting approximately 26,000 years. Hipparchus, of course, did not understand the modern mechanical explanation involving Earth's rotational axis. He simply observed the effect and calculated its rate with startling accuracy for the instruments available to him. estimating a value reasonably close to the modern measured rate. The philosophical implications of this discovery deserve real weight, even though Hipparchus himself may not have framed it in explicitly philosophical terms in his own writing, most of which has been lost, known to us primarily through later astronomers who cited and built upon his work. Every civilization covered so far in this documentary, Babylonian omen readers, Egyptian priests aligning pyramids with Orion, Vedic cosmologists describing vast, but ultimately stable cyclical time, had assumed, in one form or another, that the background stars themselves represented a fixed, permanent reference point against which everything else could be measured. Hipparchus's discovery quietly undermined that assumption at its foundation. If even the fixed stars drifted, however slowly, however imperceptibly across a single human lifetime, then the heavens were not truly eternal and unchanging after all. They simply changed on a timescale too vast for any individual observer to notice without careful, long-term record-keeping. Alongside this discovery, Hipparchus is also credited with compiling one of the first known comprehensive star catalogs in the ancient world, systematically recording the positions and relative brightness of roughly 850 stars, a monumental undertaking of patient, disciplined observation. That catalog reportedly included a brightness ranking system, dividing stars into 6 magnitude categories from brightest to faintest, a basic framework so useful that modern astronomy still uses a direct descendant of that exact system today, more than 2,000 years later. Much of Hipparchus's original work has been lost to history, surviving today primarily through the citations and preservation of a later astronomer, working roughly 3 centuries afterward in Roman Alexandria, whose own comprehensive astronomical treatise would come to dominate and define astronomical thinking for the next 14 centuries. That later astronomer's name was Claudius Ptolemy, and his synthesis of Hipparchus's data, Babylonian mathematical techniques, and Greek geometric reasoning would eventually harden into the exact same Earth-centered cosmological orthodoxy that a Polish canon named Copernicus would spend his own life quietly, cautiously working to overturn many centuries later. In an entirely different documentary, this one does not have space to fully cover. For now, though, sit with the quiet vertigo Hipparchus's discovery represents on its own terms. A civilization that had built pyramids, calendars, entire religious systems around the assumed permanence of the night sky had just discovered, through nothing more dramatic than careful comparison of old records, that permanence itself was an illusion born from insufficiently patient observation. That unsettling discovery arrived at almost exactly the moment a new imperial power was rising to dominance across the Mediterranean world, one that would take humanity's relationship with astrology somewhere genuinely strange. Rome would embrace astrology as popular entertainment for the masses, while simultaneously treating it as a mortal threat requiring the periodic banishment and execution of its own practitioners. It is worth naming how genuinely difficult Hipparchus's measurement actually was, given the tools available to him. He worked without telescopes, without precise mechanical clocks, relying instead on instruments like the armillary sphere and careful angular measurements taken by eye, comparing his results against records compiled a century and a half earlier by earlier astronomers, including Timacharis and Aristillus. That comparison across generations, trusting and building directly on the careful work of predecessors he never met, is itself a quietly radical scientific habit, one that depends on record keeping precise enough and honest enough for a later scholar to actually catch a subtle discrepancy the original observers had no way of recognizing themselves. It is worth naming a specific mathematical tool Hipparchus is credited with developing alongside his astronomical work, an early form of trigonometry, calculating relationships between angles and distances that would become foundational to nearly all later geometric astronomy, including the epicycle models Ptolemy would formalize roughly 3 centuries afterward. That mathematical contribution, developed specifically to solve astronomical problems, eventually found applications reaching far beyond the night sky entirely, into surveying, navigation, and countless practical fields, a reminder that ancient astronomy repeatedly generated mathematical tools whose value extended well past the original stargazing that first demanded them. It is worth naming how genuinely difficult Hipparchus's measurement actually was, given the tools available to him. He worked without telescopes, without precise mechanical clocks, relying instead on instruments like the armillary sphere and careful angular measurements taken by eye, comparing his results against records compiled a century and a half earlier. It is worth naming, too, that Hipparchus's star catalog, though largely lost in its original form, appears to have directly influenced Ptolemy's own later catalog within the Almagest, raising ongoing scholarly debate about how much of Ptolemy's supposedly independent observational work actually derived from his predecessor's earlier, more painstaking measurements. Consider, too, that Hipparchus is also credited with important early work estimating the distance to the moon using careful measurements of the Earth's shadow during a lunar eclipse, arriving at a figure remarkably close to the modern accepted value, a genuinely impressive feat of geometric reasoning using nothing more than careful observation and basic trigonometry. There's a further detail worth naming about how Hipparchus's work was nearly lost entirely to history, surviving today primarily through fragments and citations preserved by later astronomers rather than through his own original texts, most of which perished, a reminder of just how fragile even the most significant ancient scientific achievements actually were against the ordinary erosion of time. It is worth naming that Hipparchus also made important contributions to geography, developing improved methods for determining latitude and longitude using astronomical observation, techniques that would prove essential for later cartographers and navigators attempting to accurately map the known world using celestial reference points rather than guesswork. Consider, finally, that Hipparchus worked during a period of significant political instability across the Hellenistic world, his careful, patient astronomical observations continuing largely undisturbed even as the successor kingdoms to Alexander's empire fought recurring wars around him, evidence of how astronomical inquiry could persist as a quiet, continuous thread even through considerable surrounding political chaos. It is worth remembering, too, that Hipparchus's careful comparison of historical star position records required him to trust the accuracy of observations made by astronomers working over a century before his own lifetime, a genuine act of scientific faith in predecessors' careful methodology, the same trust in inherited, careful record-keeping that runs as a quiet thread throughout this entire documentary. It is worth naming, too, that Hipparchus's discovery of precession required him to work with observational data spanning multiple human lifetimes, meaning the actual detection of this slow, celestial drift depended entirely on the accumulated patience of scholars who would never personally witness the full pattern their careful measurements were quietly revealing across generations. It is worth noting, finally, that Hipparchus worked at a genuinely pivotal moment in the broader transmission of astronomical knowledge, standing chronologically between the earlier Babylonian observational tradition and the later Ptolemaic synthesis, meaning his own contributions functioned as a genuine bridge connecting two of the ancient world's most significant astronomical traditions into a single continuous intellectual lineage. It is worth remembering, finally, that Hipparchus worked in an era before the concept of a research career existed in any formal, funded sense, meaning his astronomical achievements were likely pursued alongside other work or supported by personal wealth. A genuinely different model of scientific labor than the institutionally funded observatories this documentary describes emerging centuries later in the Islamic world. It is worth remembering, one final time, that Hipparchus is sometimes described by historians as the founder of scientific astronomy, specifically because he combined careful observation with rigorous mathematical analysis in a way that set a genuine methodological template, one that Ptolemy would later formalize, and that would remain the basic model for astronomical inquiry for well over 1,000 years afterward. Why would a Roman emperor, holding more absolute personal power than almost any human being in history up to that point, order the execution of an astrologer specifically for correctly predicting the exact date of his own death? By the time Rome absorbed the Hellenistic world's astronomical and astrological traditions, largely following the conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd and 1st centuries before our era, astrology had transformed from an elite priestly practice into something approaching genuine mass popular culture. Ordinary Roman citizens, not simply emperors and elites, consulted astrologers for guidance on marriage, business decisions, travel timing, and countless other everyday matters, a level of popular engagement with the stars considerably broader than the tightly restricted priestly monopolies of earlier Babylon or Egypt. But for Rome's emperors specifically, astrology carried a genuinely dangerous political edge that ordinary citizens' horoscopes did not. A prediction about when or under what circumstances an emperor might die was never simply idle curiosity. It was potentially actionable political intelligence for anyone plotting to hasten that outcome. The first emperor, Augustus, reportedly took the unusual step of publicly announcing his own birth chart, an apparent attempt to control the narrative around his own astrological fate before rivals or rumor could do it for him, according to account from the historian Suetonius. Despite that public embrace of his own horoscope, Augustus also issued edicts restricting private astrological consultations, specifically concerning the deaths of prominent individuals, recognizing clearly how such predictions could be weaponized to encourage or legitimize conspiracy against those in power. His successor Tiberius, according to multiple ancient historians, was deeply, personally superstitious about astrology, reportedly testing the astrologer Thrasyllus by threatening to have him thrown from a cliff and sparing him only after Thrasyllus successfully predicted the immediate danger he himself was in. That story, whether entirely accurate in every detail or embellished by later historians, captures something genuinely true about the relationship between Roman emperors and their court astrologers. Deep, anxious dependence on their predictions, combined with an equally deep, entirely justified fear of what those same predictions might reveal or enable rivals to act on. This pattern repeated across multiple reigns with grim consistency. Astrologers were formally expelled from Rome by official decree on several documented occasions, including under Tiberius and later emperors, only to quietly return once public and imperial demand for their services reasserted itself, as it reliably did. The Emperor Domitian, ruling toward the end of the 1st century, reportedly executed individuals for consulting astrologers about his own reign's duration, treating the mere act of inquiring about his political future as an act bordering on treason. Sit with the genuine strangeness of this arrangement for a moment. The same astrological knowledge that ordinary Roman citizens consulted casually for marriage advice was, simultaneously, treated by the imperial court as a matter of state security serious enough to justify banishment and execution. That contradiction reveals something important about how astronomical and astrological knowledge had evolved since the tightly controlled priesthoods of Babylon and Egypt. Rome had genuinely democratized access to the stars for its ordinary citizens, while simultaneously treating any prediction touching imperial power as something closer to a weapon than a curiosity. Popular entertainment and political liability existing in the exact same body of astrological practice, depending entirely on who is asking the question and what answer they happen to receive. Belief in the stars had, by this point in the story, moved from temple monopoly to mass culture to genuine instrument of imperial paranoia, all within a few centuries. Rome's empire eventually fractured and, in the West, collapsed entirely, plunging much of Europe into a prolonged period of reduced scholarly activity and lost institutional knowledge. But the astronomical and mathematical traditions Rome had absorbed from Greece and Babylon did not simply vanish along with the empire's political structures. They survived and in significant respects flourished considerably further, in an entirely different empire rising to the east and south, one that would spend several centuries doing something quietly essential, actively preserving, correcting, and substantially expanding the astronomical knowledge that much of the former Roman world was gradually forgetting how to read at all. It is worth naming a further irony sitting underneath this entire chapter. Roman elites who publicly mocked astrology as vulgar superstition, fit only for the credulous masses, very often privately consulted their own personal astrologers before major decisions, a pattern of quiet hypocrisy documented across surviving letters and historical accounts from multiple senatorial families. That gap between public skepticism and private anxious belief is a genuinely human pattern, and it is worth noticing how often it recurs across this documentary in different costumes. Public confidence in reason, paired quietly with private fear of the unknown, is not unique to any single ancient civilization. It may simply be a durable feature of how humans actually relate to uncertainty. It is worth naming, specifically, the astrologer Ptolemy himself, the same figure whose astronomical Almagest would dominate Western thought for 14 centuries, also authored an equally influential astrological text called the Tetrabiblos, a reminder that in the ancient world, astronomy and astrology were rarely treated as fully separate disciplines, even by the era's most rigorous mathematical minds. It is genuinely worth marveling at how long the Tetrabiblos remained influential specifically as an astrological text, studied and referenced by practitioners for well over 1,000 years after Ptolemy's death, considerably outliving the specific astronomical model his Almagest proposed, a strange split legacy for a single ancient author. It is worth naming, too, that Roman astrology absorbed considerable influence from Egyptian tradition as well, particularly following Rome's annexation of Egypt, blending Babylonian zodiac concepts with the Egyptian Decan stars into an increasingly elaborate hybrid system that later medieval and Renaissance astrology would inherit largely intact. Consider, too, that Roman calendar reform under Julius Caesar in 46 BCE, creating what became known as the Julian calendar, drew directly on Egyptian astronomical expertise, with Caesar reportedly consulting the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes to correct the accumulated drift in the older Roman lunar calendar. Another direct thread connecting Egypt's astronomical tradition to institutions still shaping modern timekeeping. There is a further detail worth naming about how Roman astrology's popularity extended into everyday commercial life, with street corner astrologers offering consultations for a modest fee, evidence from surviving graffiti and legal complaints suggesting these services were genuinely accessible to ordinary working Romans, not simply an aristocratic indulgence reserved for the wealthy. It is worth naming that the Roman poet Manilius, writing during the reign of Augustus, composed an extensive didactic poem on astrology called the Astronomica, blending genuine astronomical knowledge with elaborate astrological interpretation. Evidence that this fusion of scientific observation and predictive belief had, by this point, become sophisticated enough to inspire serious literary treatment. Consider, finally, that Roman astrology's eventual decline in official favor coincided with the empire's gradual Christianization, as church authorities increasingly viewed astrological practice as incompatible with Christian doctrine regarding free will and divine providence, setting up the same fundamental tension between celestial determinism and religious authority this documentary later traces through medieval Europe. It is worth remembering, too, that Roman astrology's cultural influence extended into everyday language and idiom in ways still recognizable today. Phrases describing someone as being born under a lucky star, or having their fortunes written in the stars, both direct linguistic descendants of genuine, sincerely held Roman astrological belief rather than mere figures of speech invented for poetic effect. It is worth naming, too, that Roman emperors' anxiety about astrological prediction extended even to controlling access to their own birth charts, with several emperors reportedly attempting to obscure or falsify the exact date and circumstances of their births, specifically to prevent rivals from calculating potentially unfavorable astrological predictions against them. It is worth noting, finally, that Roman astrology's eventual absorption into medieval European Christian culture, despite official theological disapproval, occurred through practical channels, including medical practice, where physicians continued consulting astrological charts to time treatments for centuries. Astrology surviving not through open defiance of religious authority, but through its quiet embedding within otherwise respectable, tolerated professional practice. It is worth remembering, finally, that Roman astrology's specific vocabulary and conceptual framework, houses, aspects, ascendants, remains largely intact within modern Western astrological practice today, meaning anyone consulting a horoscope in a contemporary newspaper or app is engaging with a technical system whose core structure was substantially codified by Roman-era astrologers roughly 2,000 years ago. It is worth remembering one absolute final time that Rome's specific contribution to this documentary's broader story was never really about original astronomical discovery at all, but about scale and reach, absorbing Greek, Egyptian, and Babylonian knowledge and distributing it across an empire spanning 3 continents, ensuring these older traditions survived into the medieval world largely through Roman transmission. Who preserve humanity's accumulated star knowledge during the centuries, much of Western Europe struggled simply to maintain the basic literacy required to read the Old Greek and Roman astronomical texts at all. Beginning in the 8th century and continuing for roughly 500 years, a period modern historians often call the Islamic Golden Age, scholars across a vast territory stretching from Spain to Central Asia undertook a massive, systematic project of translating, preserving, correcting, and substantially expanding Greek, Babylonian, and Indian astronomical knowledge. This was never simply passive preservation, copying old texts without engagement. Islamic astronomers actively tested Ptolemy's models against their own fresh observations, identified genuine errors and inconsistencies, and worked to correct them using increasingly sophisticated instruments and mathematical techniques. Major observatories were constructed specifically to support this work at genuine institutional scale. The Maraga Observatory, established in 1259 in present-day Iran under the astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, brought together scholars from across the Islamic world, and reportedly even scholars from China, to collaborate on precise, systematic astronomical observation. Centuries later, the Samarkand Observatory, built in the 1420s under the astronomer Prince Ulu Beg in present-day Uzbekistan, produced star position measurements of such precision that they remained among the most accurate available anywhere in the world for well over a century afterward. Individual scholars made lasting, specific contributions that directly shaped later astronomy. Al-Battani, working in the 9th and 10th centuries, refined measurements of the length of the solar year and the precession rate Hipparchus had originally discovered, achieving accuracy that later European astronomers, including Copernicus himself, would directly cite and build upon. Al-Sufi, working in the 10th century, produced the Book of Fixed Stars, a detailed catalog building on and correcting Ptolemy's earlier work, including what may be the earliest surviving written description of the Andromeda Galaxy, referred to in his text as a small cloud, observed centuries before telescopes existed to properly resolve it. This astronomical tradition left a linguistic legacy that remains, quite literally, written into the modern night sky. A substantial number of star names still used by astronomers today derive directly from Arabic, a permanent, largely invisible fingerprint of this centuries-long scholarly project. Aldebaran, the bright star marking the eye of the constellation Taurus, derives from the Arabic Aldebaran, meaning the follower, describing its apparent following of the Pleiades star cluster across the night sky. Betelgeuse, the famous red supergiant marking the shoulder of Orion, traces its name back through Arabic transmission, Those scholars continue to debate the precise original phrase and its exact meaning across centuries of transcription and translation between languages. Vega, one of the brightest stars visible in the night sky, derives from the Arabic al-Waqi, roughly meaning the falling or swooping eagle, describing the constellation Lyra's traditional visual association in earlier astronomical tradition. Every time a modern astronomer, professional or amateur, refers to one of these stars by its familiar name, they are, whether consciously or not, invoking a direct linguistic link to scholars working in Baghdad, Damascus, Cordoba, and Samarkand roughly 1,000 years ago, actively working to keep this knowledge alive and growing. This chapter deserves to be framed honestly as something closer to a quiet, essential rescue operation than a simple historical footnote. Without this sustained, centuries-long scholarly effort, a substantial portion of Greek and Babylonian astronomical achievement might well have been permanently lost to the historical record entirely, rather than surviving to eventually reach European scholars during the later medieval and Renaissance periods. But even this remarkable rescue operation, spanning 5 centuries and multiple major observatories, could only preserve what had survived long enough to reach it. Some knowledge never made it that far, and the honest, uncomfortable truth is that we cannot fully know how much was lost before anyone thought to write down what had disappeared. It is worth naming, specifically, the scale of translation activity centered on Baghdad's House of Wisdom, established in the 8th and 9th centuries under the Abbasid Caliphate, where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian astronomical texts into Arabic on a scale historians describe as one of the largest coordinated knowledge transfer projects in pre-modern history. That project was not simply charitable preservation for its own sake. It was actively funded and encouraged by caliphs who understood, much like the Babylonian kings and Chinese emperors covered earlier in this documentary, that accurate astronomical knowledge carried real practical value for calendar keeping, religious observance timing, and navigation across a rapidly expanding empire. There's a further detail worth naming about the female scholars who participated in this scientific tradition, though their contributions are considerably less documented than their male counterparts. Maryam al-Ajliya, working in 10th century Aleppo, was a renowned astrolabe maker, her instruments prized for their precision and craftsmanship across the region. It is genuinely worth marveling at how directly the astrolabe itself, refined considerably during this Islamic scholarly period, became one of the most widely used astronomical instruments across 3 continents, allowing travelers, sailors, and scholars to calculate time, direction, and celestial positions using a single, elegantly engineered handheld device. It is worth naming, too, that this Islamic astronomical tradition made significant advances in instrument design beyond the astrolabe, including the development of more precise quadrants and sextants for measuring stellar altitude, tools that later European navigators and astronomers would adopt directly, often without fully crediting their Islamic origins. Consider, too, that Islamic astronomers made significant contributions to understanding atmospheric refraction, the bending of starlight as it passes through Earth's atmosphere, a subtle effect that had to be accounted for to achieve the level of precision their star catalogs eventually reached, a genuinely sophisticated piece of observational physics worked out centuries before formal optics existed as a discipline. There is a further detail worth naming about how this Islamic astronomical tradition approached the specific problem Ptolemy's model struggled to fully resolve. The so-called equant point, a mathematical device Ptolemy used that violated his own stated principle of uniform circular motion, a flaw scholars, including Ibn al-Shatter, worked to correct centuries before Copernicus attempted a similar solution. It is worth naming that Islamic astronomers also made significant advances in understanding the actual physical nature of the Milky Way, with the scholar Ibn al-Haytham working primarily in optics, correctly proposing it consisted of an enormous number of faint, individually indistinguishable stars rather than atmospheric vapor, centuries before telescopes could confirm this insight directly. Consider, finally, that this Islamic astronomical golden age eventually declined in its most prominent centers due to a complex combination of political fragmentation, economic pressures, and shifting religious attitudes towards certain forms of philosophical inquiry. Though astronomical practice continued in various regional centers well beyond the period most commonly associated with this tradition's peak achievements. It is worth remembering, too, that this Islamic astronomical tradition maintained careful, ongoing correspondence and scholarly exchange between observatories located thousands of miles apart, from Spain to Central Asia, creating an interconnected scientific network that allowed discoveries and corrections to spread and be verified across an enormous geographic area within a single scholar's own working lifetime. It is worth naming, too, that this Islamic astronomical tradition's observatories functioned as genuine research institutions with dedicated funding, libraries, and teaching programs, training successive generations of astronomers in a formalized educational structure that historians consider a direct precursor to the later medieval European university system that would eventually adopt many similar institutional features. It is worth noting, finally, that this Islamic astronomical tradition's eventual influence on European astronomy extended through Spain specifically, where centuries of Islamic rule left behind astronomical texts, instruments, and translated Greek works that European scholars accessed directly following the Christian reconquest. A genuinely direct geographic pathway connecting this documentary's 14th chapter to the European developments described in its companion piece. It is worth remembering, finally, that this Islamic astronomical golden age produced a genuinely staggering volume of surviving manuscripts. Modern libraries in Istanbul, Cairo, and elsewhere still holding thousands of astronomical texts from this period that scholars have not yet fully cataloged or translated, meaning our current understanding of this tradition likely represents only a partial picture of its full achievement. How much of what ancient civilizations understood about the stars is simply permanently gone, lost so completely that we cannot even accurately measure the size of the gap where that knowledge used to be? The Library of Alexandria, founded in Egypt in the early 3rd century before our era under the Ptolemaic dynasty, represented one of the ancient world's most ambitious attempts to gather, in one physical location, the accumulated written knowledge of the entire known world. Ancient sources describe scrolls numbering, by some estimates, in the hundreds of thousands, covering astronomy, mathematics, medicine, geography, and philosophy, drawn from Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, and other traditions across the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. The library's eventual destruction was never a single dramatic event, despite the popular legend of one catastrophic fire. Modern historians describe a more gradual, multi-episode decline spanning several centuries, involving multiple partial destructions, political upheaval, and slow institutional neglect. Julius Caesar's military campaign in Alexandria in 48 BCE reportedly caused fire damage to portions of the library or its surrounding warehouse districts, though ancient accounts differ considerably on the precise extent of that specific loss. Later episodes, including religious and political conflicts in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, and the eventual Muslim conquest of Egypt in the 7th century, each contributed further, disputed degrees of damage and loss to what remained of the collection and its associated scholarly institutions. Modern historians genuinely disagree about the precise sequence and relative significance of these various episodes, and popular accounts have often oversimplified and dramatized the story into a single catastrophic fire for narrative convenience. The honest historical picture is messier, more gradual, and in its own way, more genuinely tragic. Because a gradual, multi-century decline means the loss was not a single dramatic night of fire that survivors could at least clearly mourn and document. It was a slow erosion, texts uncopied as older scrolls decayed, scholarly positions unfilled as funding and institutional support waned, knowledge quietly slipping away one uncopied manuscript at a time. We do not know and cannot fully know exactly what astronomical works were lost in this process. We know some names of lost astronomers and lost texts only because later writers happened to reference or quote them before the originals disappeared entirely, leaving us fragments of fragments, citations of works we will never actually read. This uncertainty deserves to sit uncomfortably rather than be smoothed over with false confidence in either direction. We cannot know whether the losses were modest, mostly duplicated elsewhere and recoverable through other surviving sources, or genuinely catastrophic, permanently erasing entire lines of ancient astronomical inquiry we will simply never know existed at all. Meanwhile, in early medieval Europe, following the Western Roman Empire's political collapse, astronomical scholarship genuinely did stagnate for an extended period, though modern historians increasingly push back against the older, oversimplified narrative of Europe experiencing total intellectual darkness across this entire era. Monasteries did preserve some astronomical and calendrical knowledge, largely in service of calculating the correct dates for religious observances like Easter, a genuinely significant mathematical undertaking in its own right, even as the more ambitious exploratory astronomical work of the Hellenistic period found comparatively little institutional support or funding across much of the fragmented post-Roman West. The most sophisticated ongoing astronomical work during this specific period, as the previous chapter demonstrated, was happening considerably further east and south in the Islamic world's observatories and translation centers, while much of Western Europe waited, without fully realizing it was waiting, for that preserved and expanded knowledge to eventually make its way back through trade, scholarship, and later, direct cultural contact. This chapter offers no tidy resolution, deliberately, because the loss it describes has none. We are left mourning the shape of an absence we cannot precisely measure, aware only that it was substantial, and genuinely unable to say exactly what, or how much humanity's ancient relationship with the stars actually lost along the way. That mournful uncertainty sets an unresolved undertone heading directly into this documentary's climax. Because roughly 2,000 years after the Library of Alexandria was flourishing, a sponge diver working off a small Greek island was about to pull something out of the sea that would force historians to seriously reconsider exactly how much ancient astronomical sophistication may have been quietly, permanently underestimated all along. It is worth naming a specific, well-documented episode of book destruction that sits closer to our own era than most people realize. In 1258, the Mongol siege of Baghdad reportedly destroyed the House of Wisdom and its vast collection, with some historical accounts describing so many discarded manuscripts thrown into the Tigris River that its waters reportedly ran dark with ink for days. Modern historians debate the precise scale of that specific account, some suspecting later exaggeration for dramatic or political effect, but the underlying event, a catastrophic loss of one of the medieval world's great libraries during a violent conquest, is not seriously disputed. Knowledge, it turns out, has never been safe from war in any century this documentary has covered. It is worth naming, too, that some historians push back specifically against the popular narrative of a single, sudden, catastrophic burning in Alexandria, arguing instead for a picture of gradual institutional decline, reduced funding, and slow scholarly attrition stretching across several centuries, a less cinematic, but likely more historically accurate account of how the library actually faded from prominence. It is worth naming, too, that considerable ancient astronomical knowledge likely survived not through grand libraries at all, but through humbler channels, private manuscript copies circulated among scholars, commentary texts quoting older lost originals, and oral teaching traditions passed between individual mentors and students across generations. A far less centralized and considerably more resilient system than any single library. Consider, too, that similar losses of astronomical knowledge occurred in the Americas prior to European contact, with the collapse of Maya civilization's classic period cities leaving considerable uncertainty about how much astronomical knowledge existed within urban centers that were abandoned centuries before any Spanish colonizer arrived to document or destroy anything at all. There is a further detail worth naming about how modern digital preservation efforts are now attempting to prevent a repeat of these ancient losses, with international projects working to digitize and back up manuscripts held in vulnerable archives across conflict-prone regions, an explicit, direct response to the historical pattern of catastrophic, irreversible knowledge loss this chapter has described. It is worth naming that considerable ancient scientific knowledge also survived through unexpected channels, including trade networks that carried translated texts and technical instruments across vast distances, meaning knowledge preservation was never solely dependent on any single library or institution, but distributed, however unevenly, across an entire interconnected medieval world. Consider, finally, that the very uncertainty this chapter has emphasized throughout, our genuine inability to fully measure what was lost, may itself be the most historically honest conclusion available, a rare instance where acknowledging the limits of our knowledge is more valuable than constructing a falsely confident narrative simply because audiences generally prefer clean resolution to open, honest uncertainty. It is worth remembering, too, that considerable ancient astronomical knowledge also survived through unlikely secondary sources, commentary texts written specifically to explain or critique older works, which sometimes preserve substantial quotations from originals that have since been entirely lost, meaning modern scholars occasionally reconstruct lost ancient science through the careful piecing together of surviving criticism rather than the original texts themselves. It is worth naming, too, that the loss of ancient astronomical knowledge was never a purely passive process, even where no deliberate destruction occurred. Simple manuscript decay, insect damage, water exposure, and the sheer cost of hand copying texts onto fresh materials meant that even carefully preserved libraries steadily lost material to ordinary physical entropy across the centuries. It is worth noting, finally, that this pattern of knowledge loss and partial recovery, gradual decay, followed by centuries later rediscovery, repeats throughout the broader history of science well beyond astronomy alone. Ancient medical, mathematical, and engineering texts following remarkably similar trajectories of neglect, rediscovery, and eventual reintegration into mainstream scholarly understanding. It is worth remembering, finally, that the specific number of scrolls once housed at the Library of Alexandria remains genuinely disputed among historians, ancient sources offering wildly varying estimates ranging from tens of thousands to several hundred thousand. A reminder that even the basic scale of this famous loss resists precise, confident measurement using the surviving historical record. It is worth remembering, one final time, that the mournful uncertainty this chapter insists on holding is itself a kind of intellectual honesty rare in popular history. Most documentaries preferring the satisfying clarity of a single dramatic villain in a single dramatic fire, when the actual historical truth, as this chapter has tried to show, is considerably messy and, in its own way, more genuinely tragic. How did a shipwreck resting on the floor of the Aegean Sea for roughly 2,000 years contain a mechanical device so advanced that it would take European civilization another 1,400 years to build anything comparable again? In 1901, sponge divers working near the small Greek island of Antikythera discovered an ancient shipwreck, dated to roughly the 1st century before our era, containing statues, coins, and other typical cargo of an ancient Mediterranean vessel. Among the recovered artifacts was a badly corroded, unremarkable-looking lump of bronze and wood, roughly the size of shoebox, that initially attracted relatively little attention compared to the shipwreck's more visually impressive statues and coins. It was only months later, when the corroded lump cracked apart, that researchers noticed something inside that did not match anything expected from the ancient world. precisely cut bronze gears, dozens of them, meshed together with genuine mechanical sophistication. The device became known as the Antikythera mechanism, and for decades afterward, researchers struggled to understand its full function, hampered by its fragmentary, corroded condition and the sheer improbability of what it appeared to represent. Modern analysis, particularly advanced X-ray and CT imaging conducted in the 2000s and 2010s, has revealed the device's function with far greater clarity than earlier researchers could achieve. It was, in essence, an analog astronomical calculator, using an intricate system of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears. The mechanism could track and predict the positions of the sun and moon through the zodiac, model the moon's irregular orbital speed using an ingenious pin and slot mechanism accounting for its elliptical path, predict lunar and solar eclipses, and even track the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic and other Panhellenic games. It reportedly also incorporated planetary motion indicators, attempting to model the movements of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, using the same kind of epicycle-based geometric theory that would later, centuries afterward, appear formally described in Ptolemy's Almagest. Think carefully about what that timeline actually implies. This device predates Ptolemy's famous astronomical treatise by roughly 2 centuries, meaning sophisticated geometric models of planetary motion existed as functioning physical machinery well before they existed, as far as any other surviving evidence indicates, as formally documented written theory. No comparably sophisticated geared mechanical device is known to survive or to be documented in any surviving historical record from anywhere in the world for well over 1,000 years afterward, until complex geared astronomical clocks began appearing in medieval Europe starting around the 14th century. That gap is genuinely startling to sit with, honestly. Either this specific device was an extraordinary, isolated anomaly, a singular achievement never replicated or built upon by anyone else in the ancient world, or, and this is the genuinely unsettling possibility, comparable devices existed more widely and simply did not survive to be discovered. Bronze, unlike stone monuments or clay tablets, was a valuable material in the ancient and medieval world, routinely melted down and reused for coins, weapons, and other practical objects rather than preserved as historical artifacts. Any other Antikythera-style mechanisms that once existed may simply have been recycled into something else entirely, centuries or millennia before anyone thought to wonder what had been lost. This single surviving device, corroded, fragmentary, recovered almost by accident from a shipwreck that could easily have gone entirely undiscovered, forces a genuinely uncomfortable reconsideration of how confidently modern historians can claim to understand the true extent of ancient technological and astronomical achievement. Connect this directly back to the previous chapter's unresolved mourning over the Library of Alexandria's gradual, uncertain losses. If a single bronze shipwreck fragment could sit misunderstood in a museum drawer for the better part of a century before its true sophistication was properly recognized, what confidence can we genuinely have that we know the full shape of everything else that has simply never been found at all? That disquieting question, what else existed, and left absolutely no trace we have yet managed to find, is the genuine, unsettling awe this documentary's climax is built around. Not comfortable wonder at how much the ancient world achieved, something colder and considerably harder to resolve. The suspicion that our confident historical narrative may be resting on a smaller, more accidental sample of survival than anyone entirely comfortable admitting would prefer to believe. It is worth naming, specifically, who is credited with actually building the Antikythera mechanism, a question historians have debated for decades without full resolution. Some scholars have proposed a connection to the astronomer Hipparchus himself, given the device's apparent use of his lunar theory, though direct proof of his personal involvement remains circumstantial rather than confirmed. Others point toward the island of Rhodes, a known center of mechanical and astronomical expertise in the ancient world, as the mechanism's likely place of origin, based on inscriptions and stylistic details found within the device itself. Either way, whoever built it clearly had access to a mature, established tradition of precision instrument making that has otherwise left almost no other physical trace in the archaeological record. There's a further detail worth naming about the modern research effort itself. The Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, an international collaboration launched in the early 2000s, used advanced surface imaging and micro-focus computed tomography to read inscriptions on the device too faint and corroded for the naked eye to decipher, a genuinely modern technological rescue of an ancient technological mystery. It is genuinely worth marveling at how close this device came to never being noticed at all. The corroded lump sat largely overlooked for months after the initial shipwreck recovery, and only its accidental cracking apart revealed the gears inside, meaning the discovery of the ancient world's most sophisticated known machine hinged on what amounts to a lucky accident during storage. It is worth naming, too, that the Antikythera mechanism's gearing included a genuinely elegant solution for modeling the moon's variable speed across its elliptical orbit, using a pin and slot mechanism where one gear rode slightly off-center from another, a mechanical trick that required real geometric insight to design correctly using only bronze and hand tools. Consider, too, that the Antikythera mechanism's front dial displayed a functioning zodiac calendar synchronized with the Egyptian civil calendar, meaning this single device integrated Greek astronomical theory, Babylonian eclipse cycles, and Egyptian timekeeping into one unified mechanical instrument. A genuine synthesis of the ancient world's most advanced astronomical traditions in a single object small enough to hold in two hands. There is a further detail worth naming about the broader shipwreck site itself, which continued yielding significant finds decades after the mechanism's initial recovery, including a bronze statue nicknamed the Antikythera Youth and skeletal remains discovered in more recent excavations, suggesting the wreck still holds additional secrets researchers are actively working to uncover even now. It is worth naming that comparable, though less sophisticated, geared devices have since been found at other ancient sites, including simpler gear fragments discovered in Byzantine contexts dated to several centuries after the Antikythera mechanism, suggesting this specific mechanical tradition, while rare, may not have been quite as entirely isolated as its initial discovery first suggested. Consider, finally, that the Antikythera mechanism's discovery fundamentally altered how historians of science approach ancient technological claims more broadly, introducing a new default assumption that ancient capabilities may have been consistently underestimated across multiple fields, not simply astronomy, prompting renewed scholarly attention to other ancient technical achievements that had previously been dismissed as impossible or exaggerated. It is worth remembering, too, that the Antikythera mechanism's inscriptions, once properly deciphered through modern imaging, revealed a detailed user manual of sorts, explanatory text describing how to read and interpret the device's various dials and indicators, suggesting it may have been intended for use by someone without specialized astronomical training. A genuinely early example of user-friendly scientific instrument design. It is worth naming, too, that the Antikythera mechanism's precise dating, based on both the ship's other cargo and the astronomical calendar settings visible on the device itself, places its construction sometime in the 2nd century before our era, meaning it predates the birth of Jesus by well over a century and predates the fall of the Roman Republic as well. It is worth noting, finally, that the Antikythera mechanism's rediscovery fundamentally challenged a specific, previously confident assumption among historians of technology that complex geared machinery was a distinctly medieval and modern innovation, forcing a genuine and ongoing reassessment of exactly how sophisticated ancient Mediterranean engineering capability actually was at its peak. It is worth remembering, finally, that the Antikythera mechanism required an estimated total of at least 30 separate bronze gears, each individually cut by hand with teeth precise enough to mesh correctly with its neighbors, a manufacturing tolerance that would have demanded genuinely exceptional skill and specialized tools from whichever ancient workshop actually produced it. It is worth remembering one absolute final time that this device sat at the bottom of the Aegean Sea for 2,000 years, longer than the entire span of Christianity, longer than the gap separating us from the Roman Empire itself, waiting in the dark and the cold for a sponge diver to stumble across it entirely by accident. What does it actually take to end thousands of years of sky, priests holding ultimate, unquestioned authority over cosmic truth? Not a single dramatic moment. A long, violent, uneven unraveling, stretching across centuries, that this documentary has already been tracking since Chapter 3. Recall that earlier thread carefully. Babylonian priests controlling celestial omens for kings. Egyptian priests monopolizing the Nile, floods, stellar timing. Chinese court astronomers executed for unwelcome predictions. Roman emperors banishing astrologers who threatened their rule. A consistent pattern, repeating across wildly different civilizations, of sky knowledge converted directly into political and religious authority. By the time European astronomy reached its own crisis point in the 16th and 17th centuries, that ancient pattern had fused, in the specific context of Christian Europe, with an institutional church possessing genuinely formidable legal and coercive power over cosmological belief. The Roman Inquisition, formally established in 1542, existed specifically to investigate and suppress heresy within Catholic territories, and cosmological claims conflicting with established scriptural interpretation fell squarely within its jurisdiction and its considerable enforcement power. Giordano Bruno, an Italian philosopher and former Dominican friar, proposed cosmological ideas in the late 16th century that went considerably further than Copernicus's original heliocentric model, suggesting an infinite universe containing countless stars, each potentially its own sun, surrounded by its own planets. Bruno's cosmological claims were entangled with broader theological positions that the Church considered heretical on multiple grounds beyond astronomy alone, making his specific case historically complex rather than a purely simple martyrdom for astronomical truth, a nuance modern historians rightly insist on preserving. After years of imprisonment and interrogation by the Roman Inquisition, Bruno was ultimately burned at the stake in Rome in the year 1600, having refused, according to surviving accounts, to recant the totality of his theological and cosmological positions. This documentary already walked through Galileo's own trial and subsequent house arrest in earlier coverage of humanity's broader space obsession, and it is worth reconnecting that specific episode directly to this documentary's essential thread. Galileo's 1633 conviction represents, arguably, the single most visible and consequential moment in this ancient priest-astronomer power structure's final, violent unraveling. It is worth being precise and honest about what actually ended here and what did not. The Inquisition did not extinguish astronomical inquiry across Europe entirely. Astronomy continued, and in many respects accelerated, in Protestant territories and even within parts of the Catholic world where enforcement proved considerably less consistent or effective. What genuinely did end, gradually, unevenly, and never completely even to this day, was the assumption that a single religious or state authority possessed automatic, unquestionable final say over cosmological truth, simply by virtue of institutional religious or political power. That is a genuinely significant historical shift, even though, as this documentary has tried to demonstrate honestly throughout, it never happened as a single clean, triumphant moment of reason finally defeating superstition once and for all. It happened slowly, through repeated, costly individual confrontations, each one chipping away further at an authority structure that had held remarkably firm for well over 2,000 years. Figures like Bruno and Galileo were, in a genuine sense, among the last individual casualties of that specific ancient worldview's authority finally giving way under sustained pressure. A worldview this documentary has followed continuously since a Babylonian scribe first drafted an anxious letter to his king about the disappearance of Venus. This marks, deliberately, the symbolic end of the specifically ancient understanding of the stars this documentary set out to cover. Not because astronomy stopped evolving after this point, it obviously dramatically did not, but because the particular social and religious structure this documentary has traced from Mesopotamia forward, sky knowledge concentrated in a small authority claiming exclusive interpretive power, had finally, definitively broken. But breaking that specific European structure did not mean every civilization's relationship with the sky was suddenly treated with equal historical respect going forward. Because at nearly the exact same historical moment European science was finally throwing off its own inherited authority, European colonial expansion was actively working to erase other civilizations' sky knowledge entirely, often quite deliberately. It is worth naming, plainly, that Galileo's specific trial happened in 1633, the exact same century that European colonial expansion into the Americas, Africa, and parts of Asia was accelerating dramatically. The timing is not incidental to what follows in this documentary. It sets up a genuinely uncomfortable historical parallel worth sitting with directly. There is a specific historiographical tension worth naming honestly before this documentary moves forward. The story of Bruno and Galileo has, over the centuries, sometimes been simplified into a clean parable of heroic science defeating superstitious religion, a version historians of science now generally regard as too tidy, flattening genuinely complicated individual cases into a single satisfying myth. The real story this documentary has tried to show throughout is messier. Devout astronomers within the church made real contributions to the mathematics that eventually overturned geocentrism. Copernicus himself never faced persecution during his own lifetime. The line between religious authority and scientific inquiry never ran as cleanly as the simplified version suggests. That complexity does not soften what happened to Bruno or Galileo. It simply means the ending of this particular thread deserves the same careful, unflinching honesty this documentary has tried to apply everywhere else, rather than a satisfying but oversimplified villain and hero story. It is genuinely worth marveling at how long this specific European authority structure actually took to unravel, considering how quickly the underlying mathematics had already been settled decades before Galileo's own trial. Kepler had published his laws of planetary motion, built on Copernican foundations, years before the Inquisition ever formally condemned heliocentrism as false doctrine. It is worth naming, too, that this documentary's account of the Inquisition should not obscure the fact that astronomical research continued vigorously throughout this period in Protestant territories, particularly in the German states and England, where figures like Kepler worked largely free from the specific institutional pressure Galileo faced in Catholic Italy. Consider, too, that the eventual reconciliation between the Catholic Church and heliocentric astronomy proceeded gradually rather than through any single dramatic reversal, with church astronomers themselves working within the Vatican Observatory, becoming active and respected contributors to modern astronomical research well before the formal 1992 apology this documentary described earlier. There's a further detail worth naming about how the broader scientific revolution, of which this astronomical conflict formed only one part, unfolded across roughly 2 centuries rather than any single decisive moment, encompassing figures well beyond astronomy alone, in anatomy, chemistry, and physics, all gradually adopting similar standards of evidence-based inquiry over inherited authority. It is worth naming that Bruno's cosmological vision of an infinite universe filled with countless inhabited worlds, while condemned in his own lifetime, anticipated modern astronomical understanding of the universe's actual scale with a genuinely striking degree of prescience. Even though his reasoning was philosophical and theological rather than built on the observational evidence that would eventually confirm it centuries later. Consider, finally, that this entire conflict between inherited cosmological authority and empirical observation did not actually end with Galileo's case, but continued reshaping itself into new forms across subsequent centuries. Evolutionary biology, facing remarkably similar institutional resistance 2 centuries later, suggesting the underlying pattern this documentary has traced runs considerably deeper than any single scientific discipline or historical era. It is worth remembering, too, that this documentary's account of Galileo and Bruno should not obscure the considerable number of astronomers throughout this period who worked productively and without persecution, many Jesuit astronomers among them, producing genuinely valuable observational astronomy within the Church's own institutional structure, even during the exact period this chapter has described as one of active suppression. It is worth naming, too, that the broader European intellectual shift this chapter describes eventually produced its own institutional counterweight to religious authority. The founding of scientific societies, including the Royal Society in England, established in 1660, providing astronomers and other natural philosophers with an alternative source of institutional legitimacy and peer review outside direct religious oversight. It is worth noting, finally, that this documentary's account of the Inquisition-era conflict represents, in a genuine sense, the closing chapter of a pattern first introduced all the way back in this documentary's 3rd chapter, priesthoods claiming exclusive authority to interpret the sky. A pattern spanning roughly 3,000 years from Babylonian omen priests to 17th century church tribunals before finally, decisively breaking. It is worth remembering, finally, that Copernicus's own cautious approach, delaying publication until his final year of life, ultimately proved a reasonably effective personal strategy. He died peacefully rather than facing the kind of institutional persecution Bruno and Galileo would later encounter, a genuinely different individual outcome despite proposing broadly similar cosmological claims. It is worth remembering, one final time, that this chapter marks the point where this documentary's own structure shifts meaningfully from tracing separate, largely independent civilizations toward tracing a single increasingly interconnected global conversation about the sky, European, Islamic, and eventually indigenous traditions all beginning to collide, compete, and occasionally merge within the same historical time frame. What happens to a people's fundamental relationship with their own sky when their traditional star knowledge is deliberately, systematically taken from them by an outside colonizing power? This chapter treats that question as an active historical wound, not a passive, regrettable footnote. Aboriginal Australian cultures, representing some of the longest continuously maintained cultural traditions on Earth, spanning tens of thousands of years, developed sophisticated, detailed astronomical knowledge systems deeply integrated into songlines, oral law, and seasonal calendars specific to particular language groups and regions. This knowledge included detailed understanding of what astronomers call dark constellations, patterns formed not by connecting bright stars, but by the dark dust lane shapes visible against the bright background of the Milky Way, including a widely documented emu-shaped dark constellation recognized across multiple distinct Aboriginal language groups. Aboriginal astronomical knowledge also tracked the heliacal rising of specific stars to mark seasonal changes and resource availability, comparable in basic function, though developed entirely independently, to the Egyptian tracking of Sirius for predicting the Nile flood covered earlier in this documentary. British colonization of Australia, beginning in 1788, brought sustained, often violent disruption to Aboriginal communities, including forced removal from traditional lands, violent suppression of cultural and religious practices, and, for generations, policies specifically designed to prevent the transmission of traditional knowledge, including astronomical knowledge. from elders to younger generations. This was not simply passive cultural drift or accidental forgetting. Comparable to the gradual, uncertain losses this documentary described at the Library of Alexandria. It involved active, documented colonial policy explicitly aimed at severing Aboriginal communities from their own cultural and spiritual traditions. Astronomical knowledge included as an integrated part of that broader suppression. A comparable, though distinct, pattern unfolded across the Americas following European colonization. Numerous Native American nations maintained sophisticated astronomical traditions, including the Skeety Pawnese detailed star charts and ceremonial calendar, and the Anasazi sun dagger petroglyph at Chaco Canyon, precisely marking solstices and equinoxes through carved rock and shadow. Colonial policies across North America, including forced relocation, the deliberate suppression of native religious and ceremonial practices, and in later periods, government-run boarding schools explicitly designed to eliminate native cultural and linguistic transmission between generations, caused substantial, well-documented disruption to these knowledge systems. It is important and genuinely necessary for historical honesty to state plainly that this was not simply the ordinary, gradual march of one culture's ideas naturally being replaced by another's over time. This documentary has already shown, repeatedly, how sky knowledge functioned everywhere as a source of real cultural authority and identity. Colonial powers understood that dynamic clearly and targeted it accordingly. Considerable indigenous astronomical knowledge has survived regardless, preserved through the resilience and determination of indigenous communities themselves, and in recent decades has been increasingly documented, respected, and in some cases actively revitalized through direct partnership between indigenous knowledge holders and academic astronomers. But substantial, genuinely irrecoverable losses did occur and continue to be reckoned with today, particularly regarding knowledge that depended on specific elders, specific unbroken chains of oral transmission across generations, connections that colonial disruption, in numerous well-documented instances, severed permanently and without any possibility of full recovery. This chapter is deliberately positioned here, immediately following the previous chapter's account of European astronomy finally breaking free from its own inherited religious authority, because the timing itself matters and deserves to be stated directly rather than left as an implicit irony. At nearly the exact same historical moment European scientific thought was celebrating its own hard-won liberation from centuries of inherited authority over cosmological truth, European colonial expansion was actively working, in numerous documented instances, quite deliberately, to sever other civilizations from their own independently developed, equally sophisticated relationships with that same shared sky. This documentary has deliberately treated that loss as an active, ongoing wound throughout this chapter, distinct in kind from the natural decay or accidental, gradual disappearance described earlier regarding the Library of Alexandria. Some knowledge fades slowly through neglect and the simple passage of time. Some knowledge is taken deliberately by people who understood exactly what they were removing and why it mattered. That distinction between gradual forgetting and deliberate erasure deepens the darker undertone running underneath this entire documentary's final act. It leaves us somewhere considerably more uncomfortable than simple nostalgia for a vanished ancient past. It leaves quiet anger and genuine grief sitting directly alongside whatever wonder the rest of this story has offered. It is worth naming a specific, hopeful counterpoint before this chapter closes, because the story does not end entirely in loss. In recent decades, a growing field called indigenous astronomy has emerged, led substantially by indigenous scholars themselves, working to document, revitalize, and gain proper academic recognition for traditional sky knowledge systems. Researchers including Dwayne Hamaker, working closely with Aboriginal Australian communities and numerous Native American scholars and knowledge keepers, have worked to ensure this knowledge is documented on the community's own terms, crediting original knowledge holders directly rather than simply extracting the information for outside academic benefit. That approach represents a genuine, if partial, correction to the extractive pattern this documentary has criticized throughout. It does not undo the original erasure, but it does suggest that the specific chapter of active loss described here is not entirely a closed book, even after everything that was taken. It is genuinely worth marveling at the resilience required to preserve knowledge under active, sustained suppression. Aboriginal communities maintained elements of their astronomical traditions through generations of colonial policy specifically designed to sever that exact transmission, a testament to how deeply embedded and carefully guarded this knowledge actually was within community structures colonial authorities never fully understood or controlled. It is worth naming, too, that similar patterns of astronomical knowledge suppression occurred across other colonized regions this documentary has not had space to cover in full depth, including African astronomical traditions disrupted by the transatlantic slave trade and subsequent colonial administration, losses that remain, in many cases, even less documented than the Australian and American examples already discussed. Consider, too, that some contemporary Aboriginal Australian communities have successfully collaborated with professional astronomers to co-author peer-reviewed academic research, treating traditional knowledge holders as genuine research partners rather than simply subjects to be studied, a meaningful, if still uneven, shift in how modern institutions engage with indigenous astronomical expertise. There's a further detail worth naming about the specific mechanisms colonial administrations used to disrupt knowledge transmission beyond outright prohibition, including the deliberate breakup of extended family and community structures through forced relocation, severing the specific relational context through which this astronomical knowledge had always been taught and preserved across generations. It is worth naming that recovery and revitalization efforts for indigenous astronomical knowledge have increasingly incorporated digital technology, including planetarium software adapted to display traditional dark constellations and community-developed educational resources, tools that did not exist for previous generations working to preserve this knowledge against active suppression. Consider, finally, that this documentary's treatment of colonial knowledge suppression, while focused specifically on astronomical traditions, reflects a broader historical pattern repeated across medicine, agriculture, and countless other domains of indigenous expertise, astronomy simply representing one especially well-documented example of a considerably larger, ongoing process of knowledge loss and, in recent decades, gradual recovery. It is worth remembering, too, that some traditional astronomical knowledge survived colonial disruption specifically because it was embedded within broader cultural practices, songs, dances, and oral storytelling traditions that colonial authorities found more difficult to fully suppress than isolated technical knowledge alone. The astronomical content protected, in effect, by being woven inseparably into a much larger cultural fabric. It is worth naming, too, that contemporary Native American astronomy revitalization efforts have included direct collaboration with major research observatories, including partnerships allowing traditional knowledge holders to work alongside professional astronomers studying the same celestial objects from complementary cultural and scientific perspectives simultaneously. It is worth noting, finally, that this documentary's treatment of colonial erasure deliberately avoided treating indigenous astronomical traditions as a single undifferentiated category. Aboriginal Australian, Native American, and other indigenous sky knowledge systems, each representing genuinely distinct, sophisticated bodies of knowledge deserving individual recognition rather than being flattened into a single generic category of lost indigenous wisdom. It is worth remembering, finally, that the specific timing of this documentary itself, produced and released well into the 21st century, means it exists at a genuinely unusual historical moment, one where indigenous astronomical knowledge is being actively recovered and respected even as this same documentary must honestly acknowledge how much may already be permanently irretrievably gone. How much of what you already casually believe about the sky did you unknowingly inherit from people who lived, thought, and died thousands of years before you were born, without ever being told where any of it actually came from? Start with something almost nobody questions in daily life: the fact that a full circle contains exactly 360 degrees. That specific number traces directly back to Babylonian mathematics, likely connected to their base 60 numerical system and their observation that a solar year lasted approximately 360 days before more precise correction. The 7-day week, another structure almost universally treated today as simply natural, obvious, unquestioned, traces back to Babylonian astrology's identification of 7 visible moving celestial bodies: the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets visible without a telescope. In numerous languages, including English, the days of the week still directly encode this ancient astrological inheritance. Sunday for the sun, Monday for the moon, Saturday for Saturn. Other languages, particularly the Romance languages descended from Latin, preserve the connection even more transparently across all 7 days. The 12 constellations of the zodiac, still referenced casually in countless contexts today, from horoscope columns to casual conversation about someone's astrological sign, trace directly back to Babylonian astronomical and astrological tradition, later systematized and substantially expanded by Greek astronomers, including Ptolemy. Even the 12-month calendar structure most of the world uses today has deep roots reaching back through Roman calendar reforms, themselves influenced by earlier Babylonian lunar-based calendar systems, layered and modified repeatedly across many centuries of accumulated astronomical observation and political calendar reform. The names of the visible planets themselves, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, in English and many other languages derive directly from Roman adaptations of earlier Greek names, which themselves frequently adapted still earlier Babylonian astrological associations and deity names. Star names carried forward from the Islamic Golden Age scholarship covered earlier in this documentary: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Vega, Rigel, Altair, remain in continuous, casual, everyday use by professional and amateur astronomers alike, an unbroken linguistic thread stretching back roughly 1,000 years without most casual sky watchers today ever realizing it. It is worth pausing directly on the specific word horoscope itself, still used casually and constantly in modern popular culture, deriving from ancient Greek roots meaning, roughly, observer of the hour, a direct linguistic descendant of the exact anxious. Omen reading tradition, this documentary traced back to Babylonian court astrologers in Chapter 3. None of these inheritances are typically presented to us, growing up, as ancient religious or astrological belief systems requiring examination or context. They are simply presented as neutral, obvious facts about how the world works, absorbed unconsciously in early childhood, long before anyone develops the tools to question where any of it actually originated. That is genuinely worth sitting with directly, because it complicates any tidy, comfortable distinction between ancient superstition and modern established fact. The line between those two categories, this documentary would suggest, is considerably blurrier in practice than most people casually assume it to be. We do not, generally, believe that Saturn is an actual malevolent Roman god capable of directly influencing human affairs, the way ancient Romans genuinely did. But we still, every single week, without a second thought, call one of our 7 days by his name, embedding that ancient belief system permanently and invisibly into the basic structure of how we schedule our lives. This is, quietly, one of the strangest and most genuinely uncanny discoveries this entire documentary has to offer. Not some dramatic, singular revelation about a lost civilization or a hidden ancient machine. Just the slow, accumulating realization that the ancient sky watchers this documentary has spent hours walking through never actually disappeared at all. They simply became invisible, embedded so thoroughly and so casually into the basic structure of everyday modern life, calendars, clocks, weekday names, star charts, that we stop consciously noticing they were ever there in the first place, mistaking their ancient choices for neutral, self-evident features of reality itself. Which leaves one final, quieter question to end this entire documentary on, one that circles all the way back to that very first eclipse we opened on hours ago. Has the actual physical sky changed meaningfully at all across this entire 10,000-year story? Or has it only ever been the way we have chosen, generation after generation, culture after culture, to look at it? It is worth naming a few more of these hidden inheritances directly, because once you start noticing them, they turn up almost everywhere. The word disaster itself derives from Latin roots meaning, roughly, ill-starred, a linguistic fossil of the old belief that catastrophe arrived written in the position of the stars, embedded permanently into a word we now use without a second thought. Consider also the word influenza, the illness. It derives from the Italian for influence, reflecting the old astrological belief that outbreaks of disease were caused by the unfavorable influence of planetary alignments, a theory of medicine we would now consider entirely superstitious, quietly fossilized inside a word doctors still use every single day. These are not isolated curiosities. They are evidence of just how deeply and how invisibly the ancient relationship with the sky has threaded itself through the language and structure of modern life, surviving not through deliberate preservation, but through sheer, unnoticed habit, repeated so many billions of times across so many generations that nobody thought to question it. It is genuinely worth marveling, too, at how the very structure of scientific institutions still carries this ancient inheritance forward, largely unexamined. University astronomy departments organize their academic calendars around a system of months and weeks first formalized by Rome, built on Babylonian foundations, teaching genuinely modern physics inside a temporal framework inherited directly from the omen readers this documentary described in its opening chapters. It is worth naming, too, the specific etymology of the word consider itself, derived from Latin roots meaning, roughly, with the stars, reflecting an old belief that careful thought or observation of a situation was intimately tied to studying the sky for guidance, a linguistic fossil sitting inside one of the most common verbs in the English language. Consider, too, the word jovial, meaning cheerful or good-humored, deriving directly from Jupiter, reflecting the old astrological belief that people born under Jupiter's influence possessed naturally optimistic, expansive temperaments, a personality theory modern psychology would firmly reject, embedded quietly inside a word people still use to compliment each other today. Consider, too, the word saturnine, still occasionally used to describe a gloomy or sluggish temperament, deriving directly from the planet Saturn, reflecting the old astrological belief that Saturn's influence produced melancholy and slowness in those born under its sway, another entire personality theory quietly fossilized inside ordinary English vocabulary. Consider, too, the word mercurial, describing someone quick, changeable, and unpredictable in temperament, deriving directly from Mercury, the fastest-moving visible planet, whose swift, erratic-seeming path across the sky gave rise to an entire personality archetype still invoked casually in everyday conversation, thousands of years after the original astrological reasoning behind it. Consider, too, the word lunatic, still occasionally used despite its clearly outdated and stigmatizing implications, deriving directly from Luna, the moon, reflecting an old belief that lunar phases directly influenced mental instability, a theory modern psychology and neuroscience have found no credible evidence to support. Yet the word itself persisted in common usage for centuries after that underlying belief was abandoned. Consider, finally, the word ecstasy itself, deriving from ancient Greek roots suggesting a state of being outside oneself, a concept ancient astronomers and mystics alike associated with certain intense states of cosmic contemplation. Another small piece of evidence for just how thoroughly the ancient relationship with the sky has embedded itself into the vocabulary we use for even our most ordinary emotional experiences today. Consider, finally, the word disaster's close cousin, the phrase ill-starred, still occasionally used to describe an unfortunate person or doomed venture, a direct, transparent linguistic fossil of astrological belief requiring no etymological excavation at all, hiding in plain sight within ordinary contemporary speech. Consider, finally, one last linguistic fossil worth naming, the phrase thanking one's lucky stars, still spoken casually today by people who would likely reject astrology as pure superstition if asked directly. Proof that these ancient beliefs survive most successfully not as consciously held convictions, but as habits of speech nobody thinks to examine. Consider, finally, the specific structure of the modern zodiac itself, still dividing the sky into 12-30-degree segments despite the actual constellations having drifted considerably out of alignment with those segments due to precession, meaning the zodiac sign many people casually identify with today no longer corresponds to the actual constellation the sun occupies during their birth month at all. Consider, one final time before this documentary approaches its close, that even the word calendar itself derives from the Latin calendarium, originally referring to a Roman account book where interest payments were recorded, itself derived from calends, the first day of the Roman month, meaning the very word we use for tracking time is rooted in ancient bookkeeping tied directly to the lunar cycle Rome inherited from Babylon. If you walked outside tonight, away from city light, and looked directly up, would you actually see anything fundamentally different from what a Babylonian priest, an Egyptian astronomer, or a Maya scribe would have recognized, standing in that exact same spot thousands of years ago? The honest answer, remarkably, is almost nothing. On the timescale of a single human lifetime, or even several thousand recorded years of human civilization, the night sky's basic, visible structure remains essentially, recognizably unchanged. The same constellations, the same bright stars, the same slow, patient wheel of the sky turning overhead. Hipparchus's precession, covered earlier in this documentary, does shift star positions relative to the equinox points, genuinely, measurably, over its roughly 26,000-year cycle. But across the mere few thousand years of recorded human astronomical observation this documentary has walked through, that shift remains subtle, gradual, essentially invisible to casual observation without careful long-term measurement. A handful of individual stars have measurably moved or changed brightness, or, in rare and dramatic cases like the 1054 guest star covered in Chapter 5, appeared suddenly and then faded from view entirely over subsequent centuries. But the overwhelming majority of what any ancient sky watcher saw, you could still find and recognize tonight in roughly the same position with roughly the same brightness. What has changed dramatically, overwhelmingly, is not the sky itself. It is us. It is the way we have collectively, gradually stopped looking at it with anything resembling the sustained, disciplined, obsessive attention this documentary has spent the last several hours describing. Modern light pollution alone has rendered the night sky genuinely, physically invisible to a majority of the world's population. Researchers studying global light pollution have estimated that a substantial majority of people living in North America and Europe can no longer see the Milky Way from their own homes at all, a sight that was, for nearly every civilization covered in this documentary, simply an unremarkable nightly fact of life. Think back across everything this documentary has walked through together. A Paleolithic hunter who needed to track the moon's phase to survive. A Babylonian priest whose career, and possibly his life, depended on correctly reading Venus's movements. A Polynesian navigator who memorized dozens of star paths because a single mistake meant death at sea, with no possibility of correction. None of those people had the luxury of ignoring the sky. It was survival information, political authority, religious destiny, and navigational necessity, all at once. demanding genuine, sustained, disciplined attention as a basic condition of daily life, not an occasional recreational glance upward on a clear night when nothing better happened to be on. This documentary has deliberately refused, throughout, to offer a clean, comfortable narrative of steady human progress from primitive fear toward modern rational understanding. The story looped. It backslid. Beautiful mathematical achievement sat directly alongside ritual bloodshed. Genuine scientific curiosity sat directly alongside violent political suppression. It offers no neat resolution here at the end either, because the honest truth does not actually provide one. We know considerably more about the physical mechanics of the universe today than any ancient astronomer could have imagined possible. And most of us, if we are honest, look up at the actual night sky considerably less often and with considerably less sustained attention than nearly any civilization this documentary has covered. Perhaps that is the genuinely uncanny, quietly unsettling thought worth sitting with as this documentary closes. Ancient people were not, in any meaningful sense, less intelligent or less capable than we are. They simply lived inside a world that demanded, forced, an intimacy with the sky that modern convenience has made almost entirely optional. We return, wordlessly, to where this entire story began. That first ancient city, mid-eclipse, convinced the sun itself was dying overhead. Screaming, ritual, desperate improvised noise thrown at an indifferent sky. Except now, having walked through everything between that moment and this one, you understand exactly what that panic actually meant and everything it eventually became. The eclipse itself has not changed. The physics behind it has not changed. What changed, slowly, unevenly, across 10,000 years of counting, watching, fearing, calculating, worshipping, colonizing, and finally quietly forgetting was simply us and the depth of attention we were willing to keep giving it. No comforting summary, no tairi final lesson. Just the same physical sky those ancient watchers once stared into with such obsessive, terrified, devoted attention, still hanging directly above you tonight, exactly as it always has, quietly waiting to see whether anyone still remembers how to actually look. If there is anything worth carrying away from this entire journey, it is probably not a fact. It is not a date or a civilization's name or the precise mechanism of an eclipse. It is something closer to a posture, a willingness to stand still outside for longer than feels strictly necessary and actually look. Every civilization this documentary has walked through, however differently they explained what they were seeing, however violently some of them acted on those explanations, shared that one basic habit in common. They looked, consistently, patiently, as though the sky owed them an answer, even when, most of the time, it plainly did not. You do not need a temple or a priesthood or a bronze-geared machine pulled from a shipwreck to participate in that same old habit. You only need a clear night and a willingness to tilt your head back for a few minutes longer than you probably planned to. So that is where this documentary leaves you. Not with an answer, with an invitation, the same one that has apparently been extended to every single generation of humans who ever existed, stretching back farther than written language, farther than agriculture, farther than fire itself. Go outside, look up, see what you notice. And that, ultimately, might be the single most honest thing this entire documentary has to offer. Not an answer, not a warning, just a plain, quiet fact that the looking itself, stretched across 43,000 years of bone carvings, pyramids, temples, and shipwrecks, has always mattered more than whatever any single civilization hoped the looking might eventually explain. There is one final image worth leaving you with before this documentary closes for good. Somewhere, right now, in an observatory or a quiet backyard far from city light, someone is looking up for no particular reason beyond the same stubborn, ancient impulse that carried a Paleolithic hunter, a Babylonian priest, and a sponge diver off a Greek island. That impulse has never required a reason. It has simply never stopped. Consider, finally, that this documentary itself, spoken into your ears through a device connected to satellites orbiting the very planet it describes, represents the latest link in an unbroken chain stretching back to that first eclipse and that first hunter with a bone and a knife. Proof that the chain has never actually broken, only changed its shape. Consider one final time that every single person who has ever lived across every civilization this documentary has covered has looked up at fundamentally the same physical sky you can see tonight, a genuinely rare point of continuity connecting a Babylonian scribe, a Maya astronomer, and you, separated by thousands of years but united by the same simple act of looking up. Consider one final time the peculiar privilege of living in an era that finally understands, with real confidence, both how the sky actually works and how badly, for how long, humanity misunderstood it, a rare vantage point that makes it possible to genuinely appreciate every single wrong answer this documentary has walked through, not as failure, but as necessary, patient groundwork. Consider, finally, that this documentary has deliberately avoided offering a single unifying theory explaining why humans across every studied culture developed this shared fascination with the sky. Because no single explanation, survival necessity, religious impulse, political control, pure curiosity, fully accounts for the sheer universality and persistence of the pattern. And pretending otherwise would betray the honest complexity this entire story actually deserves. Consider, finally, that this entire documentary could easily have been organized differently, chronologically rather than thematically, geographically rather than by emotional beat, and would still have arrived at roughly the same underlying conclusion, because the pattern this story describes does not depend on any single organizing structure. It is simply, stubbornly, everywhere you look once you know to look for it. Consider, finally, one last time, that the very fact you have listened this far, through 10,000 years of fear, mathematics, violence, wonder, and loss, is itself a small continuation of the exact pattern this documentary has described. Attention paid to the sky, however indirect, however mediated through screens and speakers rather than direct observation, remains attention paid nonetheless. Consider, finally, one absolute last thought before this documentary closes for good. Every single fact recited across these 20 chapters will, eventually, also fade, misremembered, revised by future scholarship, or simply forgotten the way so much else this documentary has mourned was forgotten. Only the looking itself, the act, repeated endlessly, seems capable of genuinely outlasting any single civilization's particular understanding of what meant. Consider one final time that this documentary began with a scream and ends deliberately with something closer to quiet. That shift from panic to patience, from terror to attention, is not simply a stylistic choice. It mirrors, in miniature, the actual 10,000-year journey this entire story has just walked you through. Go outside tonight if you can. Look up. That is genuinely the whole point.